The shriek was mine. I knew that much. A raw, animal sound ripped from my throat. My fist connected with something wet and yielding. The sickening crunch of bone and cartilage, a counterpoint to the sudden, blinding flash of agony behind my own right eye. Blood, warm and metallic, bloomed across my face, not from the impact, but from somewhere deeper, an internal rupture. I stumbled back, clutching my throbbing skull, the reflection in the broken glass showing not just my attacker, but myself, bleeding, bewildered, and very, very close to screaming again. That was later, much later, at the point where sanity had already begun to fray around the edges. It started, as these things always do, with a seemingly innocuous phone call and a promise of easy money, luring me into what I mistook for a normal day. It's never a normal day for me, not anymore. Another fine establishment of law and order, I thought, as the squad car coughed its way into the lot of what generously passed for a police station. My gut clenched, the familiar warning bell of impending disaster chiming somewhere in the deeper recesses of my brain. The building itself looked less like a functioning precinct and more like a set piece for a post-apocalyptic B-movie. The police insignia, half buried in a tangled mess of tall, sun-baked weeds, lay crookedly, its metallic gleam long since dulled to a matte gray. The letters PO were missing from the faded sign above the main doors, leaving only lice in their wake, a remarkably fitting, if unintentional, commentary on my general luck. Graffiti, a violent spray of neon obscenities, crawled like festering wounds across the outer walls. If not for the two other vehicles at the very back of the lot, both in similarly sorry states, I would have sworn they'd pulled into the wrong address. The patrol cars were no better than the station itself. Their emblem and motto, "To serve and protect," were faded, almost ghostly, smeared with years of road grime and neglect. Tires were flat, slumped in on themselves like deflated balloons, and one's taillight was a shattered mosaic of red plastic. Yeah, warning bells definitely should have gone off in my head. Louder bells, klaxons, even, but if you can't trust the police, who can you trust? A rhetorical question, given my track record. The answer was usually no one, especially not yourself. I attributed the building's abysmal condition to budget cuts, the kind of deep, vicious cuts that gnawed at the bone. Officers, I'd read somewhere, frequently and openly protested the city's cheap financial support by wearing mismatched socks and all sorts of inappropriate pants, ranging from army print to clown stripes. Maybe this was their ultimate protest, letting the place rot. I snorted, a dry, humorless sound that felt at home in the stifling air. Two officers, both surprisingly bland, escorted me inside. If the main lobby was any indication, then the interior was as poorly maintained as the exterior. The air in here was a thick, wet blanket, clinging to the inside of my lungs. It tasted like static electricity and old blood, a flavor I'd grown to recognize from other places I'd rather forget. I waited by the reception desk, perched on an old schoolhouse chair whose cracked, pea-green back did not match the splintered blonde wood of the two identical chairs next to it. It was like they'd been scavenged from three different eras of public school humiliation. While the officers traded a few hushed words with the woman behind the desk, I couldn't help but notice how remarkably similar the three of them were. It wasn't just the uniform either, though those were pristine, almost unnervingly so, a stark contrast to their surroundings. No, it was more fundamental. The three were the same height, possessed the exact same shade and cut of dark, uninteresting hair, carried themselves with an identical, almost robotic posture, and shared the same lean, athletic build. Too neat, too uniform, beyond what even the most disciplined police force could achieve. It pricked at that old, familiar sensation, the one that whispered wrong. It was the same feeling that had coiled in my gut when Mitch's voice had changed that night. or when I'd realize the walls themselves were breathing. My hand, without conscious thought, went to my old analog wristwatch, tracing the worn metal of the crown. A small, futile attempt to ground myself in something tangible. Something that actually moved at a predictable pace. "Excuse me," I interrupted, my voice sounding oddly strained in the oppressive silence. I walked over to the trio, the worn leather of my jacket squeaking faintly with the movement. It was a familiar comfort, a second skin that had seen more nightmares than most men lived in a lifetime. One of the officers who'd brought me in turned towards me, his face a perfectly blank canvas. "What?" he asked, his tone devoid of inflection, like a recording played on a loop. I motioned to a chipped ceramic mug full of cheap plastic pens on the counter. "Can I have one?" I asked, trying for casual, hoping it masked the uneasy tremor in my hands. "Yeah, sure," he replied, his gaze drifting over my shoulder, as if he found the peeling paint on the far wall more interesting than my request. His eyes were a startlingly pale blue, like chipped ice. I pocketed the pen happily, a small, petty victory. If I was going to be stuck here all evening, subjected to whatever this was, at least I'd get a souvenir. The three continued their hushed, emotionless conversation while I returned to my mismatched chair, waiting in the humid, stagnant lobby. Couldn't they at least open a window? Get a breeze rolling? The air was so thick and tasted so bitter that I could barely breathe. It felt like being sealed in a jar. I tried to focus on Buster, my scruffy terrier mix, back in the motel room. He was my anchor, my one consistent, untainted thing in a life that was otherwise a carousel of horrors. God, I hoped he was okay. Curled up on the old futon in my current dump of an apartment, oblivious to this particular brand of hell. Once the officers sorted everything out, I had no idea what everything entailed. Given their almost telepathic lack of spoken words, they led me down a long, dirty corridor. Dried leaves, skeletal remains of autumn, littered the ground, crunching under my worn boots as I walked. Surely, they could find room in their budget for a janitor. As we moved through the station, the decay seemed to deepen. Missing doors, like absent teeth in a skeletal maw, gaped into darkened rooms. Broken windows stared out blankly, exposing the guts of the building to the elements. I even saw a jagged hole in the roof, a tear in the fabric of the sky. Frankly, I half expected to see a family of raccoons scurrying about, making a nest in the broken filing cabinets. There also seemed to be a surprisingly small roster of officers on duty in the station. We seemed to pass the same two guys almost everywhere we went, their identical faces popping up like bad penny apparitions. It was like a glitch in a cheap simulation, making me feel like I was caught in some endless, repeating loop. "In here," said one of the uniformed men, motioning to a set of double doors that looked like they hadn't been painted since the Truman administration. "We'll come get you when it's time." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry, and stepped through the doors. The smell on the other side was even worse than in the lobby, if that was possible. It was a sickening, cloying mix of sweat, ozone, and that unique, unsettling odor of slightly burnt skin after a few hours under a merciless summer sun. Unsurprisingly, the room was full of men, maybe a dozen or so, all with eerily similar features to my own. Aside from one old man huddled in the corner, we also looked about the same age, roughly mid-30s, just past the point where youthful optimism completely gives way to weary resignation. "Guess we're all here for the lineup, huh?" I asked, forcing a cheerful tone, an attempt to break the ice and inject some semblance of normalcy into the suffocating atmosphere. The others averted their gazes, a ripple of unease passing through them. The situation wasn't ideal, missing the season finale of my favorite show for this. But I saw no reason to be sour about it. It was our civic duty, and being grumpy wouldn't change a thing. We'd all been cherry-picked, I assumed, to act as distractors in a police lineup. I hadn't been particularly thrilled when the police officers stopped me on my way home from work, telling me I matched the description of a violent mugger. but I calmed down once they reassured me that I was not the suspect, merely a decoy, a cog in the machine, a disposable piece. The old man's head rose slowly, his movement stiff, like a marionette with tangled strings. His eyes, though clouded with age, met mine with a profound sadness. "Son," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to echo in the oppressive quiet. "You won't be leaving anytime soon." When I saw his face fully, a gasp caught in my throat. He was old. Yes, undeniably so. But his facial features were remarkably similar to my own. Beyond similar. We had the same shade of green eyes, curved nose, and the exact same set of high cheekbones. If we were to walk around town together, people would surely assume he was my dad. My reflection, aged by half a century and then some. "Oh, well, that's okay. I'm not in a rush," I answered cheerfully, trying to sound more convinced than I felt. My hand went to my watch again, checking the time that seemed to crawl. My gaze shifted from the old man to the others in the room. Each face I looked at was a variation on a theme, a disturbing kaleidoscope of my own features. We all shared a remarkable likeness, a common template that was growing increasingly unnerving. Whoever the victim was, they'd have a hell of a hard time identifying the attacker. No one stood out. Even I would have trouble telling us apart. A thought that should have been amusing but instead sent a cold tendril of fear coiling in my gut. I thought the others would be as amused as I was, a shared moment of bizarre camaraderie. But they all kept to themselves, their shoulders hunched, their faces drawn and pale, unable to find a conversational partner. I took a seat so I could wait for the officer to return. The silence started making me nervous, a profound, heavy silence, as though everyone knew a secret I wasn't privy to, a joke whose punchline I hadn't heard. Every now and again, I caught them glancing at me from the corner of their eyes, their gazes quick and furtive, filled with a strange mix of pity and dread. It was deeply unnerving. Silence. It was so quiet that I could hear the faint, sickly hum of neon lights all the way down the hall, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the building. They played in peculiar unison, a low, atonal drone, like instruments in a macabre orchestra. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. It was the same gut-wrenching certainty I'd felt on that long, lonely road when the hitchhiker had opened his mouth, or in that pristine, antique-filled house where Olivia had laid out her gruesome carpet. This place reeked of the same wrongness. The universe, I'd learned, was a vast, indifferent farm, and I was just another piece of livestock. The door creaked open, a sound like a tortured moan. The others in the room flinched, cringed, and recoiled as an officer stepped inside. I honestly couldn't tell if it was one of the two that had driven me in, or a different officer altogether. Their faces were too similar, too interchangeable, like mass-produced dolls. It was only when I saw him standing next to the other men in the room that the full, chilling realization crashed over me. He, too, could pass as one of us. The pale eyes, the high cheekbones, the set of the jaw. He looked like me, like us. My skin crawled, 1,000 tiny insects marching across my flesh, at the eerie, undeniable truth that everyone I had seen in the past hour or so looked just like me. How had I not noticed sooner? How had I been so blind? I tried to shake the unsettling feeling away with a forced shiver, a physical attempt to dislodge the dread, but I was only half successful. It stuck to me like tar. The officer lifted a hand, his index finger, long and unblemished, pointing precisely at 6 of us. You there, you two, you, and you, by the wall," he commanded, his voice flat, devoid of the usual police cadence. I got up and walked over, a sense of resigned fatalism washing over me. Of course I was chosen. The others, the 5 singled out, gasped and groaned, their earlier stoicism crumbling into open, raw fear. They approached reluctantly, like condemned men walking to the gallows. Though I did not fully understand their gloomy reactions, a dark, cold part of me felt the same way. Still, the quicker we went through the lineup, the quicker we'd get to go home. I, for one, was grimly glad I'd been chosen to be part of Group 1. Get it over with. The officer handed out numbered boards. My board, Nashfisse, looked ancient, as if it had been passed down through generations of decoys. Its corners were rounded with wear, the dark wood smoothed by countless nervous hands. Coffee stains coated the surface like ancient hieroglyphs. In yellowing, brittle tape kept portions of it from falling apart entirely. The others took their boards with as much enthusiasm as a kid handed a plateful of steamed broccoli. I'd never seen grown men quite manage the childlike look of disgust and accompanying pout until that day. They looked like kids forced to eat boiled sprouts and endure a visit from a distant, creepy uncle. I was starting to understand why. This wasn't just civic duty. This felt like a trap. It dragged me back to Mitch's apartment, the cold dread of realizing someone you knew, someone you trusted, wasn't who they seemed, or that thing in the walls, breathing, watching. Once we received our numbers, we were ushered into a suffocatingly narrow room with doors on both ends. I heard the thick thud of a lock engaging behind us, the sound echoing ominously in the tight space. It made me wonder if the mugger was in the room with me. But no, that was ridiculous. Fortunately, I was at a police station. If there was one place a violent mugger wouldn't try anything stupid, it'd be in the middle of a police station, right? The back wall was decorated in faded height lines, like those seen in mugshots. They made me realize that, strangely enough, we were all the exact same height, right down to the half-inch. It was unnatural, a physical impossibility for 6 randomly selected men. In front of us was a large glass pane through which we could clearly see a pair of identical-looking police officers sitting on stools, watching us. That's odd, I remembered thinking, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Don't they usually use double-sided mirrors for these things? The glass was too clear, too reflective of our own anxious faces. It was a window, not a shield. Not me, not me, not me, murmured number 3, his voice a dry, reedy whisper, quivering with palpable fear. He was running his hands through his hair, his eyes wide and fixed on nothing. He wasn't the only one acting strangely. Number 1 and number 4 were huddled in the far corner, facing away from the window, their shoulders pressed against the wall as if trying to merge with it. Number 2 and number 6 were fidgeting, their eyes darting wildly, whispering beneath their breaths, a low, frantic drone that seemed to vibrate in the air. Grow up, I thought, trying to quell the rising panic in my own chest. Why were they all so nervous? Was I missing something obvious? Could we get in trouble if we were mistakenly identified? The question was rhetorical, but the answer was becoming frighteningly clear. Yes, we were in trouble, deep trouble. Every fiber of my being wanted to bolt, to smash a fist through the glass, to do anything but stand there like a lamb at the slaughter. Then the victim walked into the room on the other side of the glass, even though he held his head low, shrouded in shadows. I couldn't help but notice the chilling similarities. He had my build, the same slightly slumped shoulders, and my haircut, the same unruly dark waves that always refused to lie flat. His body was covered in bruises, a sickening tapestry of purple and blue, and his white shirt was stained with dark, crusty blood. I felt a chill run down the back of my neck, filling me with the same anxious dread that radiated off my fellow distractors. A primal feeling in my gut urged me to run away, yet I found myself paralyzed with unexplainable fear, rooted to the spot. This was silly. There was no reason to be afraid, or so I desperately hoped. My nervousness increased with every slow, deliberate step the victim took. He looked pretty banged up, that was for sure. There was no reason to think he hadn't been attacked by a mugger, a common enough occurrence in any city. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else, something far more insidious, was going on. The victim's head slowly turned upwards. He looked at each of us in turn, his gaze lingering, searching. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to snap. "Oh, God," I whispered, the words catching in my throat, a mere puff of air. I was looking at myself. He wasn't just a crude look-alike like the others. No, he was definitely me. Even through the swollen, split lip and the grotesque black eye that bloomed like a bruised plum, I recognized every square inch of my face, the specific placement of my constellation of freckles across the bridge of my nose, the faint, jagged childhood scar along my hairline from that stupid bike accident when I was 7, my right eye, which was subtly, almost imperceptibly, smaller than the left. He had them all. It was my worst nightmare, staring at me from every angle, like that damned mirror in The Thing That Looked Back. My double, my dark reflection, standing before me. I didn't have time to fully take in the phenomena, to reconcile what my eyes were telling me with what my brain insisted was impossible. Before the doppelganger lifted his arm, a skeletal finger, trembling with accusatory intent, outstretched, I knew before he even did it. I knew he was going to point to me. I knew. Yet it didn't spare me the shock when he did it. It felt like being smacked in the face by a stray baseball, a sudden, concussive blow that rattled my teeth. He pointed straight at me, an electrifying feeling surging through my body as he did so. A jolt, pure and cold, shot through me, rooting me to the spot even as my mind screamed for escape. If that wasn't bad enough, the others in the lineup suddenly calmed down. The tension drained from their shoulders. Their faces slackened with relief. They looked like they just dodged a bullet, which only sent me into a full-blown panic. When I saw the 2 identical police officers rise from their seats on the other side of the glass, their pale eyes fixed on me with chilling intent, I knew I had to run. There was no explanation, no arguing, no reasoning with whatever fresh hell this was. I bolted, pure adrenaline coursing through my veins like liquid fire, towards the emergency exit at the far end of the room. The door was locked, of course, always locked. I could hear the distinct jingle of keys from the other side of the room, followed by the heavy clunk of a lock mechanism. There was no doubt in my mind that the officers were coming for me, with a fair dose of adrenaline fueling my actions, pushing my body beyond its limits. I grabbed the heavy, cylindrical fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. Its cold metal felt like a lifeline in my trembling hands. I swung it, a desperate, clumsy arc, smashing it against the doorknob. The first blow merely dented the cheap brass. The second cracked the door frame. It took 3 tries, my muscles screaming in protest, but it finally broke off, splintering the wood, allowing the door to swing open just as the cops came in from the other end of the room, their faces still eerily blank, their movements synchronized. I could vaguely hear them shouting, though I could not make out a word of what they were saying over the combined sounds of my frantic heartbeat, a drum solo of terror, and the rushing of blood in my head. I ran as fast as my feet allowed, the worn soles of my boots slapping against the grimy linoleum, feeling myself drowning in unexplainable fear, a cold, dark current dragging me under. Lost. I was utterly lost. Lost in the building, a labyrinth of decaying corridors. Lost in the suffocating embrace of fear. Lost in desperate and unshakable panic. An alarm went off then, a piercing, metallic shriek that echoed through the station, practically paralyzing me with its insistent, wailing urgency. More than ever, I wanted to escape this endless maze of rundown hallways and broken light fixtures, where every shadow seemed to twist into something menacing. I could barely hear the officers' pounding footsteps over the mechanical warning call, but my senses, honed by years of running from things that shouldn't exist, were just sharp enough that I could safely evade them, weaving through the decrepit architecture like a rat in a crumbling maze. Every turning was identical, every door a faded reflection of the last. It was a nightmare of repetition. I ran for what felt like hours, though it could have been mere minutes. Time lost all meaning in that place. I ran until my chest burned with exhaustion, a searing pain that radiated from my lungs, and my muscles cramped, stiffening into painful knots. I ran until I came across a familiar sight, the waiting room from where I'd been in earlier, hoping to warn the others, perhaps even to find a moment of respite. I stumbled inside. The room was empty, but for the old man in the back corner, he was still there, hunched over, motionless. My heart leaped with a flicker of hope, however dim. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice raw, ragged. "We've got to get out of here, now!" He didn't answer, didn't stir. A cold dread, colder than anything I'd felt before, began to seep into my bones. I walked closer, my footsteps strangely loud in the silence, and noticed something on his head. My scar. That's impossible, I thought, a desperate, animalistic gasp escaping my lips. The truth, when it hit me, was a physical blow. That scar. My scar. The jagged line above the old man's brow was identical to the one I carried, a permanent reminder of a childhood fall, a misstep on a curb, stitches, and my mother's worried face. My childhood, his skin, a mottled, sun-dried parchment, like a forgotten apple left on a windowsill for a month, was stretched tight over his skeletal features. His eyes were open, but blank, staring at something beyond my comprehension. He was dead, and he was me. I recoiled in terror, a loud, primal scream tearing itself from my throat. My mind reeled, trying to grasp the horrific impossibility of it all. Suddenly, I felt a pair of cold, strong fingers digging into my shoulder with the crushing strength of a crocodile's jaw, locking me in place. Again, I shouted, a desperate, guttural sound, wildly swatting at the captor's hand. By twisting my shoulder uncomfortably, pulling against the searing pain, I managed to break free of the vice-like grip and spin around, only to be confronted with my bruised doppelganger, the same ruined face I'd seen in the lineup room, a look of bitter contempt, a mirror of every resentful thought I'd ever harbored, had found a permanent home on his features. I never realized how unsettling that look was when I gave it to others, how utterly devoid of humanity. My look-alike deliberately blocked the exit, his body a solid, immovable wall, ensuring that escape would not be easy. He took a slow, deliberate step towards me, his bruised face a mask of cold fury. I acted on instinct, pure survival overriding every other thought, and felt my arm flying towards his face, a desperate, flailing punch. The sound of broken glass erupted from him, a sickening, crystalline crunch, as my fist connected with his already damaged eye. Pain. Sharp, blinding pain. 1,000 tiny shards of glass exploding behind my own right eye. 1,000 needles plunging into the optic nerve. I stumbled to the side, clutching my throbbing skull, my vision blurring into a kaleidoscopic swirl of agony and dark shapes. It thumped and prickled with 1,000 needles, each beat of my heart sending a fresh wave of nausea through me. My vision became blurry, but not blurry enough to keep me from seeing the other me run towards me, a distorted, vengeful specter. I had to defend myself. I punched, elbowed, and jabbed at him, every move a desperate attempt to create space, to survive. Few of my blows actually connected. I'm not exactly a martial arts expert, more of a flail and hope kind of guy, but the ones that did sent sharp, reciprocal pain flooding into my own body, an unbearable feedback loop. My frantic blitz came to an end when I went for his stomach, a desperate shove more than a punch. The impact nearly took my breath away. There was no beating him. I had to run. I shoved him aside with all the strength I had left, fully expecting him to try and grab me, to wrestle me to the ground. To my surprise, he stumbled, then fell to the floor, collapsing in a heap, and didn't try to get up. Had I hurt him more than I thought? Or was he simply breaking? My relief was short-lived, a fleeting whisper of hope in a hurricane of dread. As soon as I stepped back out into the hallway, leaning heavily against the doorframe. I ran into a pair of officers. Their expressions were strangely blank, devoid of any discernible emotion, like wax figures. A sudden, chilling thought came to mind when I realized that I was covered in bruises. The same bruises I'd seen on my doppelganger. What if they thought I was the victim? Or worse, what if I was the victim now? "He's in there," I said, my voice raspy, mustering up every bit of calm that I could manage, pointing a trembling finger back into the room. It was a gamble, a desperate lie. The officers, without hesitating, their movements still unnervingly synchronized, ran into the waiting area. I didn't know how long my ruse would work, how long they'd be fooled. So I took off towards the entrance, my injured eye throbbing with every frantic step. When I reached the lobby, gasping for air, the receptionist from earlier stood up and turned to me. I only looked at her for a moment, a fleeting glance, but my eyes caught sight of it. My scar, the unmistakable childhood mark, clearly visible on her forehead. What the hell? There was no time to think or try to understand. My face everywhere. This place was a hall of mirrors, and every reflection was a trap. She started chasing after me, her footsteps a chilling echo of my own. So I ran out the doors as fast as my battered legs could carry me. The air outside smelled so fresh, so clean, devoid of the stagnant, metallic aftertaste that had choked me in the police station. It was dark out, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. And I remember feeling a desperate flicker of hope that I could blend into the comforting anonymity of the night and escape this surreal nightmare. But then I heard stomping footsteps behind me, heavy and relentless. Beams of harsh, white light sliced through the darkness, sweeping across my back, illuminating me like a target. I could hear sirens blaring in the distance, growing louder, closer, a mournful wail that echoed the scream still trapped in my throat. I recall running, a desperate, headlong flight, but I confess, I don't remember how I got home. I have no recollection of reaching my apartment complex, unlocking my door, or collapsing into bed. The details are a hazy, terrified blur, but I must have. I woke up this morning safe and sound in my bed, albeit quite sore, every muscle aching, every bone protesting. The memory of the previous night was a jumbled nightmare mosaic, but it was real. When I got up to brush my teeth, my reflection sent a fresh shiver down my spine, a cold serpent coiling in my gut. My face was bruised and swollen, a grotesque caricature of my normal self. The wounds were identical, precisely identical, to the ones I saw on the victim at the police station. The busted lip, the black eye, the nasty cut on his cheek, they were all there, perfectly replicated on my own face. My heart raced wildly, blurry after images dancing in my head. Running, police officers, my face everywhere. As I leaned back against the cool tile of the bathroom wall, a sudden weight in my pocket snagged my attention. I reached for it, my fingers closing around a small, smooth object. I retrieved the pen I'd taken from the police station, inspecting it closely. The city police motto was written on it, though half of it was scratched out, defaced, as if by design. It read in faded, cheap ink. To serve, it didn't say who or what, just to serve. I tossed the pen onto the counter, the hollow click echoing in the small room. The thought hit me then, a cold, hard certainty. I wasn't just a decoy, I was the next victim, and the one after that. Just another cog in a broken, bleeding machine. Character count, 9 or 738. The dimple was wrong. Not the faint, endearing indentation that creased the left side of Mike's face when he genuinely smiled, but a deeper, unsettling gouge, carved unnaturally into his right cheek. My heart, already a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, plummeted into the pit of my stomach, dissolving whatever brave facade I'd tried to construct. The tiny, almost invisible constellation of freckles that usually dusted the bridge of his nose were gone. erased by an uncanny smoothness of skin. And his eyes. Mike's eyes were a pale, almost crystalline blue, like ice on a winter morning. These, though the right shade, held a flat, lifeless quality, like cheap glass marbles. He was skinnier, too, his clothes hanging looser than they should, and the way his skin seemed stretched taut over his cheekbones, almost too pale, too perfect, sent a shiver straight down my spine. This wasn't Mike. This was a grotesque, living forgery, a piece of art meticulously crafted from a blurry photograph and a deeply malevolent intent. But to understand how I found myself staring into the unsettling mimicry of a man I had loved, paralyzed between flight and confrontation in a bustling cafe, you have to rewind 6 weeks. 6 weeks since I last spoke to the real Mike, since I'd tried to sever the painful, tangled thread of a relationship that was doomed from the start. And since the first unsettling vibration of my phone late one Saturday night, I remember that night with a clarity I usually reserve for the faces of the things that haunt my nightmares. My new apartment, a sterile box on the wrong side of town, offered little comfort. 2 weeks I'd been there. 2 weeks trying to forget the familiar ache of Mike's absence. 2 weeks telling myself I'd done the right thing. He'd kept me locked out of his life for the entirety of our 2 years together. A ghost in his own narrative, afraid to let his friends or family know he was anything other than what they expected. And I, being the fool I am, had tolerated it, holding on to the crumbs of his affection. It was a pattern of my life, a grim comedy where I kept stepping into the same trap with different bait. My old analog wristwatch, a battered relic that probably kept time more out of spite than precision, showed 2:50 a.m. I was trying to lose myself in the predictable drama of a vampire show on Netflix, the flickering blue light of the screen doing little to soothe the restless hum beneath my skin. Just when I thought I might finally drift off, my phone buzzed on the bedside table. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a misdial from some late-night drunk. But then I saw the name. Mike. My stomach clenched, a familiar mix of hope and dread coiling within me. Saturday, 4:51 a.m. Mike, are you awake? I stared at the screen, a bitter laugh bubbling up in my throat. Are you awake? Of course I was awake. I was always awake. I was a man perpetually running on fumes, a transient shadow in a world too bright and too loud. Sleep was a luxury and usually a trap. Me, why are you texting me? I typed, my fingers hovering over the send button. Part of me, the part I hated, wanted to type. I miss you too. Wanted to ask, are you okay? But the other part, the cynical, self-preservative part, slammed the door shut. He'd shut me out for 2 years. He didn't get to waltz back in at 3 a.m. Mike, I miss you. Another text. My jaw tightened. The words felt hollow, like a bad actor reading lines. This was a game, a manipulation. I knew Mike, or I thought I did. He wasn't usually so direct after a breakup. He preferred to ghost, to make himself scarce, letting the silence do the talking. This felt clumsy, desperate, and maybe, just maybe, I was desperate enough to believe it. My stupid, soft core, the reluctant conscience that always seemed to drag me into the path of speeding trains, was whispering. He's hurting. Maybe he's finally ready to talk. Me, whatever game you think you're playing, I'm not interested. If you're drunk and need help, I can book an Uber for you. Otherwise, don't text me again. I hit send, the finality of it a cold comfort. A heavy silence followed. No response. Good or bad? I wasn't sure. I tossed the phone onto my bed, a sigh escaping my lips, thick with exhaustion and a familiar sense of self-loathing. Mike was probably just looking for a late-night hookup, a warm body to fill the void, and I, like an idiot, had almost let him. I tried to focus on the TV, on the manufactured angst of fictional vampires, but my mind kept replaying the messages. The phantom ache of a love I knew was toxic, but couldn't quite excise. I eventually drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep around 5. The next morning, the city was already stirring, a low, mechanical hum seeping through my thin apartment walls. My head pounded with the dull rhythm of too little sleep and too much emotional baggage. I grabbed my worn leather jacket. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation, my scent, and headed out. Brunch with Sarah. She was my anchor, the one person who saw through my cynical armor to the wreckage beneath. Without her, I often wondered if I'd simply float away, a detached observer of my own slow unraveling. My old wristwatch, a nervous tick now more than a timekeeper, felt cool against my wrist. I checked it, then again. 9:47 a.m., already late. Sarah was already at our usual little cafe, nursing a cup of tea, her expression a mix of concern and exasperation. Nothing ever got past her. She took one look at my bloodshot eyes and the tremor in my hand as I reached for the menu. "You look like death warmed over." "Leo," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Don't tell me you were binging TVD again. You only do that when something's eating at you." I offered a weak, practiced smile. "Just had to finish some work, you know? Deadline." Then couldn't shut my brain off. It was a lie, a flimsy shield against her relentless perception. But what was I supposed to say? Oh, just my dead-to-me ex-boyfriend, stirring up old wounds with cryptic texts from beyond the grave? Our coffee arrived, a dark, steaming lifeline, and I practically inhaled the damn thing. The bitter warmth scalded my throat but grounded me slightly. Sarah's gaze, steady and unwavering, was a physical weight on me. "Lee," she pushed, using the nickname only she was allowed. "I know you, and I know when something's bothering you. Talk to me." Sarah had never been Mike's biggest fan. Rightly so. He was a manipulative enigma, and she'd seen it long before I had. That's why it was so hard to open up about him. Even to her, I knew she wouldn't judge me for my feelings, but I wasn't sure she'd understand why. I still harbored them, why his texts had ripped open old scars. The truth was, I still cared. A lot. And admitting that out loud felt like admitting a weakness, a fundamental flaw in my hardened exterior. But looking at her, seeing the genuine concern etched on her face, the words started to uncoil. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hesitating over the screen, before I finally navigated to the messages. I handed it to her. She read them, her brow furrowing slightly. Then she slowly handed it back. A silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken questions. I braced myself for the lecture, the inevitable. "I told you so." "You know," she said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay if you still care about him. I get that. I do. Do you want some advice, or do you just need someone to listen?" Her words hit me like a physical blow, the sheer, unexpected kindness of it. I had this miserable habit of assuming the worst from people, even those I knew loved me. Trauma does that to you. I suppose it teaches you to expect betrayal, to anticipate the blow. I hadn't even realized I'd been holding my breath until it left my lungs in a ragged sigh. "Advice," I managed, my voice raspy. "Please." She reached across the table, her hand warm and firm over mine. "Like I said, it's okay to care. But Leo, I don't think it's a good idea to let him back into your life. Not after everything. Ultimately, it's your call, but given his track record, I would highly recommend against it." "Thanks," I mumbled, squeezing her hand. "I know. I feel like we never got the closure we needed." The words tasted like ash. Closure. What a joke. I'd secretly hoped, for weeks, that he'd show up at my doorstep, begging me to take him back, finally ready to admit he was wrong, ready to be with me. But I'd moved. He didn't know my new address. It was impossible. A small part of me, the part that still believed in impossible things, mourned that. "If that's what you need to get over him," Sarah said, a sympathetic tilt to her head, "then go for it." We talked for a while longer, the mundane rhythm of brunch a strange balm to the churning turmoil within me. Eventually, we said our goodbyes, and I walked home, the city noise a dull roar in my ears. My apartment, when I finally reached it, felt smaller, colder. Buster, my scruffy terrier mix, greeted me with an excited whirl of tail and a happy yelp, his nails clicking on the laminate floor. He was my one constant, my unshakable point of light in a universe determined to drag me into the shadows. I bent down, burying my face in his scruff, inhaling his familiar dog scent, a comfort beyond words. "Hey, buddy," I murmured, scratching behind his ears. He licked my face enthusiastically. "Good boy." I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, the dull clatter echoing in the quiet. The rest of the day crawled by, uneventful save for the nagging thought of Mike. That night, I succumbed to exhaustion, drifting off on the couch while a movie played unheeded on the television. My old watch glowed faintly in the dim light. Its hands, unconcerned with the horror they might witness, ticked steadily towards the witching hour. Sunday, 3:03 a.m. My phone dinged, tearing me from the shallow depths of sleep. I fumbled for it, my eyes gritty, the screen burning white in the darkness. "Mike, I know you said not to text you again, but I really need to talk to you." I sat bolt upright, the remnants of sleep fleeing like startled birds. 3 a.m. Again. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. A familiar, unwelcome guest. Me. What could you possibly need to talk about at 3 a.m? I typed, my fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't right. This wasn't Mike. Not the Mike I knew. Anyway, not the one who hid from life. Not the one who pursued it with this kind of unsettling tenacity. "Mike, I don't mean right now, but in person. I don't like how we ended things." My heart skipped a beat, then hammered against my ribs. In person. Just yesterday, I'd been talking to Sarah about needing closure, about wishing he'd show up, and now this. It was too much of a coincidence. My observational skills, honed by years of trying to see the subtle wrongness in the world, screamed at me. This was uncanny. This was wrong. But that damn reluctant conscience, the fatal flaw in my programming, overruled my better judgment. The part of me that still craved resolution, still longed for the version of Mike I'd conjured in my head, started to take over. My phone dinged again, jerking me from my internal debate. "Mike, can I see you?" The words were simple, innocuous, yet they felt laced with menace. My mind raced, weighing options. I could ignore it, block the number, but then, would I ever know? Would that craving for closure fester, leaving me in this perpetual state of limbo? My cynicism, usually a heavy blanket, felt thin, porous. "Me, fine. You can come over tomorrow. But I recently moved. It might be a bit of a drive for you." I typed, my hand shaking slightly. The sheer recklessness of the decision made my head spin. I was inviting trouble, directly to my doorstep. My go-bag was in the closet, ready for flight, but I was instead choosing to stand my ground. Stupid. Leo. So utterly, fundamentally stupid. "Mike, that's all right." A simple response. No questions about the address, no surprise. Just that flat, unnerving acceptance. I texted him my new address, my stomach churning with a mix of fear and perverse anticipation. He replied with, "See you soon." The screen went dark, and I sank back into the couch cushions. The silence of the apartment suddenly amplified, heavy and waiting. I didn't sleep a wink after that, just lay there, eyes open, watching the pre-dawn light creep through the blinds, painting the room in shades of bruised purple and gray. The sun had just begun to paint the sky with thin strokes of orange when I finally gave up on sleep. I made myself a cup of stale coffee, my lifeblood, and managed to choke down a piece of toast. The idea of seeing Mike, or whatever this was, in a few hours, sent a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Was I actually going to do this? Was I going to invite whatever sick game this was into my fragile existence? I decided to take Buster to the park. The cool morning air, tinged with the scent of damp earth and exhaust fumes, felt like a slap in the face. I walked the familiar route, Buster trotting happily beside me, occasionally tugging at his leash. The park was still mostly empty, save for a few dedicated early risers and their dogs. I sat on a lonely bench, watching Buster chase a squirrel with an innocent joy I envied. My thoughts spiraled, a vortex of anxiety. What if we just ended up sleeping together, reigniting a toxic flame? Or worse, what if we actually got back together, consigning me to another 2 years of emotional purgatory? Then it happened, that familiar, prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Like invisible eyes were boring into me. I scanned the perimeter, my gaze sharp, honed by years of hypervigilance. Nothing, just the rustle of leaves, the distant drone of traffic, but the feeling persisted, a cold, insidious dread. It was like I was being watched, but barely. A subtle wrongness, a disturbance in the normal hum of the morning. My eyes darted to a gnarled oak tree a few benches away. Had something shifted behind it? A flash of dark against the pale trunk. I squinted, my heart thrumming. No, nothing. Just the play of light and shadow, my sleep-deprived mind playing tricks. Or so I tried to tell myself. The thought of the man I was supposed to meet, the one who wasn't Mike, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. "Come on, Buster, time to go," I called, my voice rougher than usual. Buster, ever obedient, bounded towards me, tail wagging furiously. I scratched his head, slipped him a treat, then clipped on his leash. The walk home felt endless, the air suddenly thick, heavy. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, every rustle of leaves a whispered warning. The feeling of being watched clung to me like a shroud. I was practically vibrating with unease by the time I reached my apartment building. Relief, a fleeting, fragile emotion, washed over me as I fumbled with the key to my deadbolt. But it didn't last. My phone buzzed as I stepped inside, the familiar chime echoing in the quiet. I glanced at it, my heart seizing in my chest. A Facebook message. From Richard, Mike's older brother. My breath hitched. Sunday, 10:17 a.m. Richard. "Hey, Leo, it's Richard. I'm not sure if you remember me. We met at Mike's party a few months ago." I remembered, barely. Mike had introduced me as a friend, a casual dismissal that had stung at the time. My hand, steady for a moment, began to tremble. Me. "Hi, yes, I remember. What's up?" I typed, my mind racing. What could Richard want? Did Mike finally tell him about us? Was he angry? Relief, cold and immediate, flooded me when I saw the next message. No, this wasn't about us. It was something else. Something far, far worse. "Richard, this might be a bit overdue, but honestly, between the funeral and the grieving, it's been kind of hard to get the news out to some of Mike's newer friends. I just wanted to let you know he passed away last weekend." The words blurred on the screen, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. Passed away last weekend. My mind, usually so adept at compartmentalizing, at shoving unpleasantness into the dark corners of my psyche, simply short-circuited. Last weekend. That meant Mike was dead. Before the first text, before the "I miss you," before the invitation to meet in person, I almost typed, "Are you sure?" But luckily, some shred of decency, that reluctant conscience again, stopped me. Of course he was sure. This was his brother. This was real. The bile rose in my throat, hot and acrid. Mike was dead, gone, and I hadn't even known, because he'd shut me out. The irony was a bitter, painful taste on my tongue. Me, I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you for taking the time to let me know. Sorry if this comes across as insensitive, but can I ask who currently has his phone? A stupid question, an insensitive question, but the dread was a physical thing now, a clawed hand gripping my insides. If Mike was dead, who was texting me? Richard. We never found it. Actually, it probably got lost in the accident. Did you need something from it? Never found it. The answer echoed in my head, a chilling confirmation of my worst fears. There was no Mike, only this imposter, this thing that had his phone, and that thing had my address, my new address, the one I'd given it just hours ago. Me, no, he just had a few photos from an old trip with some friends, but it's not important. A clumsy lie, my mind was reeling, trying to connect the dots, trying to find a logical explanation for the impossible. A sick prank? Someone had found his phone and was messing with me? But the cold dread that was spreading through me felt far more insidious than a simple prank. It felt predatory. Richard. Well, I'll let you know if it ever turns up. Me. That won't be necessary, but thank you. I practically threw the phone onto the couch cushion. What the hell? My brain scrambled for rational answers, but there were none. Only the horrifying, undeniable truth. Mike was dead, and something else was wearing his digital skin, hunting me, and it had my address, my new, supposedly safe, anonymous address. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I had to go. Now. No time for logic, no time for explanations, just movement, flight. My go bag, always packed for moments like this, was already in the closet. I grabbed it, then Buster's carrier, my hands fumbling with the buckles. My first thought was Sarah. She was the only person I trusted, the only one who wouldn't immediately dismiss my wild ramblings as a stress-induced delusion. I called her, my voice thin, ragged with fear. Sarah, I gasped. I need a place to stay. Now, for a few days. Something's happened. I can't explain. She didn't hesitate, didn't even ask for details. Just that quiet, reassuring strength that made her my indispensable anchor. Of course, Leo, my spare room's open. Stay as long as you need. Just get here safely. Thank God, I breathed, the words almost a sob. She was a lifesaver, maybe even literally. I wasted no time, stuffing a few last-minute essentials into my duffel, grabbing Buster, and bolting out the door of my supposedly safe haven. The anonymous apartment, meant to be a fresh start, had become a tomb. I drove like a man possessed, the worn leather of my jacket a familiar comfort against my racing heart. The rearview mirror was a constant source of dread, every passing car a potential threat. I was being paranoid, I knew, but in my life, paranoia was often just extreme vigilance. When I arrived at Sarah's, the late afternoon sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, unsettling shadows. She met me at the door, her face etched with worry. Buster, sensing my agitation, whimpered softly in his carrier. Lee, what's going on? She asked, her eyes scanning my pale face. I think I have a stalker situation, I said, the words tasting like ash. And I need to move again. Permanently. She ushered me inside, her concern deepening. You need to call the police. Leo. Now. I nodded, though the thought of explaining this twisted nightmare to a police officer, detailing how my dead ex-boyfriend was texting me from beyond the grave and now knew my address, filled me with a fresh wave of nausea. They'd think I was crazy. They'd send me for a psych evaluation. I knew the drill. It was why I never went to the authorities. They rarely believe the truth, especially when the truth wore the skin of the impossible. But what choice did I have now? After a silent dinner, Sarah set me up on her couch, a makeshift bed of cushions and blankets. Buster, curled protectively at my feet, was the only thing that kept me from fully fracturing. Sarah excused herself, heading to her bedroom, the soft click of her door echoing in the suddenly vast silence. Sleep, of course, was an impossibility. My old wristwatch, its faint tick-tock, a relentless metronome of dread. Read 11:37 p.m., hours until the witching hour. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of grief and terror. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old photos of Mike, the real Mike, his laugh lines, the tiny crinkle at the corner of his left eye when he smiled, the subtle shift in his posture when he was trying to hide something. The pain of his loss, now truly cemented by Richard's message, was a raw, aching wound. I couldn't believe he was gone, and I couldn't believe someone, or something, was sick enough to pretend to be him, to mock my grief. The tears, hot and stinging, tracked paths down my temples into my hairline. Then, a sudden, sharp ding from my phone. Not a text message, an app notification. My stomach did a violent somersault. It was from the doggy cams I'd set up around my apartment for Buster. I'd installed them when I moved in, just to check on him if I was out late. A new layer of paranoia, born from years of unsettling experiences, that now proved grimly prophetic. Movement detected in living room. The words burned into my retina. My throat closed, a wave of cold nausea washing over me. Every instinct screamed at me to throw the phone away, to curl into a ball and disappear. But that damn reluctant conscience, coupled with a morbid curiosity I deeply regretted, forced my hand. I had to see. I had to know. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate drum. I opened the app, my thumb slick with sweat. The screen flickered, the grainy night vision image of my living room resolving itself into horrifying clarity. There, standing in the middle of my living room, was a man I had never seen before in my life. Not truly. He was a scarecrow of a man, impossibly thin, as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. His hair was dark and long, hanging in greasy, lank strands around a face that was gaunt, sallow, not Mike's short punna blonde hair, but the shape of him, the lean frame, the way he held himself. It was an echo, a distorted shadow. And the eyes, the dark, empty pools of his eyes seemed to be staring directly into the camera, directly at me. He didn't look right. Every cell in my body screamed wrong, wrong, wrong. Then a faint, almost imperceptible ding from my phone. Not from the app. A text message. My eyes snapped to the notification bar. Monday, 3:09 a.m. Mike, where are you? My breath hitched, a strangled gasp tearing through my throat. I slammed the doggy cam app shut. The image seared into my mind and practically threw my phone across the living room. It skittered across the polished wood floor, coming to rest against a discarded shoe. Buster, startled by the sudden movement, woke with a panicked yelp, scrambling to his feet. I managed to calm him down with a shaky hand, but the bile was already rising in my throat, hot and acrid. I scrambled off the couch, tripping over my own feet, and stumbled towards the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before my stomach convulsed. I must have woken Sarah. The light in her bedroom flickered on, a thin sliver beneath her door. I heard her stir, then the soft padding of her bare feet on the carpet. "Leo, what's going on?" Her voice, laced with sleep and concern, floated through the thin bathroom door. I was emptying my stomach, the dry heaves racking my entire body. Every meal I'd eaten in the past week seemed to make a reappearance. It took an eternity for the vomiting to finally subside, leaving me weak and trembling, slumped against the cool porcelain. At some point, Sarah had come in, her hand gently rubbing my back, a calming rhythm. "Ugh, he's in my apartment," I croaked, my voice raw. "What? Who?" Sarah sounded utterly bewildered, as if she thought she was dreaming. The stalker? The guy who's been texting me through Mike's phone. I saw him on the dog cam. He's there. Now." I recounted the terrifying image on the app. The gaunt face, the wrong hair, the empty eyes. I told her about the text message, the chilling precision of the timing. She stared at me, her face pale in the dim bathroom light. "You have to check the app again, Leo," she said, her voice firm. "No," I begged, shaking my head. "Please, Sarah, I need to sleep." "We can deal with this in the morning. I'll call the cops. First thing, I promise." She hesitated, her gaze searching my face, assessing the raw terror etched there. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, but you call them. No excuses, and we're sticking together. You're sleeping in my room?" I didn't argue. I crawled into the futon Sarah had set up in her room, Buster curling up next to me, a warm, solid weight, despite the terror. I eventually drifted off, exhaustion claiming me. I woke up groggy and disoriented. The room was bright, sunlight streaming through Sarah's window. My old wristwatch showed it was almost 10 a.m. Sarah was gone, presumably at work. A crumpled note lay on her dresser. "Had to go to work. Tried waking you up earlier, but you wouldn't budge. Also, don't forget to call the cops. Breakfast in the kitchen, XOXO. Shit. Monday at work. I'd completely forgotten. 20 missed calls from my boss. My life was falling apart, piece by piece." I fired off a quick email with some lame excuse about a sudden, virulent illness, begging for tomorrow off too. Then, I trudged into the kitchen. Sarah, bless her, had left a plate of eggs and bacon covered in saran wrap. Sometimes, I wished I was wired differently, just so I could marry Sarah. She was the best of us. After breakfast, I called the police. The conversation was exactly as I'd feared. Disbelief, thinly veiled skepticism. They'd send an officer to check out the apartment, but I'd have to go there to show them the dog cam footage, the text messages, and explain everything. The thought of exposing Mike's death, of explaining our secret relationship to his family through a police report, made my stomach clench. It was a ridiculous thing to worry about given the present danger, but the fear of being outed without consent was a deep, visceral one. Just as I was steeling myself for the inevitable, another message notification snapped me back to the present. My blood ran cold. Monday, 11:42 a.m. "Mike, I thought we were supposed to meet up yesterday." This was the first time it had texted me during the day, during Mike's waking hours. My breath caught in my throat. I knew a lot of people would say that it probably knew where Sarah lived now too, and that thought sent me spiraling. I needed to get out of here. If it was a person, a stalker, maybe it wouldn't do anything in broad daylight, surrounded by people. If I went back to my apartment, at least the police would be there. I told Sarah's landlord I had to run an errand, then headed to my car, Buster trailing behind me. I couldn't risk him, not with whatever malevolence was lurking in my apartment. I dropped him off at a doggy daycare, giving him a long, reassuring hug, promising I'd be back. His trusting eyes filled me with a fresh surge of resolve. I had to end this. On the way to my apartment, I decided to stop for coffee. I needed the caffeine, a desperate attempt to jumpstart my exhausted brain. The cafe I wanted was on a busy street, no parking nearby, so I had to find a spot a couple of blocks away. As I walked, the oppressive sense of being watched returned, a cold, clammy hand on my spine. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting nervously around. There, just up ahead, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a man, tall, slender, and then I saw it, or thought I did, a flash of dark, long hair. My breath hitched. No, not here. Not now. I spun around, a jolt of raw terror shooting through me, ready to bolt. That's when I bumped into Mike. Except, it wasn't Mike. Not my Mike. The dimple was wrong. It wasn't the small, almost imperceptible indentation that appeared on Mike's left cheek when he smiled, but a deeper, unsettling crevice on his right. The tiny, almost invisible constellation of freckles that usually dusted the bridge of his nose were gone, erased by an uncanny smoothness of skin. And his eyes. Mike's eyes were a pale, almost crystalline blue, like ice on a winter morning. These, though the right shade, held a flat, lifeless quality, like cheap glass marbles. He was skinnier, too, his clothes hanging looser than they should, and the way his skin seemed stretched taut over his cheekbones, almost too pale, too perfect, sent a shiver straight down my spine. It was a wax figure, a cheap knockoff, meticulously crafted but fundamentally wrong. Like someone had tried to replicate a masterpiece from a pixelated photo, and the result was just an insult to the original. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, just staring at this thing. My mind was a frantic scramble. Should I play along? Should I make a run for it? Scream? Punch it? My go bag felt like a lead weight on my shoulder. Every instinct screamed for flight, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the morbid curiosity, that fatal flaw of mine. Or maybe it was the insidious pull of something that looked so much like the man I'd loved, a twisted promise of closure. "Leo, you don't look so good." The voice was Mike's, his inflections, his slight lilt, his breathy pause at the end of his name. But it was just a little too perfect, a mimicry, a parrot's echo. The sound snapped me out of my trance. "Huh? Oh, I haven't seen you since the breakup," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I guess seeing you feels kind of unreal." Unreal was a gross understatement. It felt like standing on the edge of an abyss and peering into its unknowable depths. But a strange, desperate thought took root in my mind. What if I could find out what happened? What if this was my only chance to understand? And so, against every survival instinct I possessed, I decided to play along. This imposter, this mimicry, invited me to have coffee with him to discuss our breakup. Right now, I'm sitting in this cafe, a cup of lukewarm coffee growing cold in front of me, waiting for it to get back from the bathroom. I had already written the first part of this in a frantic, almost therapeutic haze beforehand. But now I'm writing the rest while I still can. My hands are shaking. You're probably thinking I'm crazy right now. I can already imagine the comments, the dismissive pats on the head. Grief is a powerful thing. Leo, you're just imagining things. Please, don't judge me. I need to know what happened to Mike. I miss him so much. I know, with every fiber of my being, that this thing isn't Mike, but it looks like him. It sounds like him. And maybe in my messed up, haunted world, that's enough. Maybe that's all I'll ever get. Character count, 9948. The air was a blade, a living thing that sawed through my worn leather jacket, cutting bone deep. My breath plumed, thick and white, in the impossible cold of a fast food kitchen that hours ago had reeked of stale grease and lukewarm apathy. The digital thermostat, just inches from my face, screamed 40 degree warm, but it might as well have read, "Welcome to hell." My eyes were locked on the polished stainless steel of the freezer door, not at my own reflection, but at hers. She stood directly behind me, a tattered dress hanging from a skeletal frame, her eyes cavernous voids that swallowed what little light remained. An icy tendril, impossibly long, brushed against my neck, a phantom touch that prickled every nerve ending, screaming against the instinct to turn, to flee. Her voice, and when it came, was a whisper of fractured glass and forgotten prayers, seeping into the marrow of my bones. "Why not look at me?" That voice, that impossible cold, was the culmination of a night that had begun with nothing but the promise of a mediocre paycheck and the usual quiet dread of another transient job in another forgotten town. I'd walked into that greasy mausoleum of a restaurant believing it would be just another shift. I was wrong. Another town, another nameless fast food joint. That was my life. Always on the move, always taking the late shifts, the ones nobody else wanted. They paid in cash, required minimal paperwork, and offered a blessed anonymity that I clung to like a drowning man to driftwood. Tonight it was a burger joint called Big Bite Burger, stuck on the desolate outskirts of what felt like a forgotten corner of existence. The locals, in their limited capacity for conversation, had whispered about its history. Not the food, never the food, but the ground it sat on. Sacred ground, they'd mumbled, eyes wide and bloodshot, or narrowed with suspicion. A site of old disappearances, strange rituals, things that went bump in the night and never came back. Whatever. My worn leather jacket had seen enough sacred ground to last a lifetime, most of it ending in something profane. I just needed the $20 an hour and the quiet solitude of working alone. The kind of quiet that usually meant you were invisible. That's how I liked it. But there was no quiet tonight. Not really. The air itself felt heavy, humid, pregnant with an unspoken tension that had nothing to do with the storm brewing outside. Its distant rumble still a low growl on the horizon. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, a high-pitched whine that usually faded into background noise, but tonight grated on my nerves, amplifying every creak and groan of the aging building. And the smell. Oh God, the smell. Usually it was just the stale, comforting aroma of fried grease and cheap coffee. Tonight it was oppressive, cloying, thick with something metallic, something like old blood trying to hide beneath layers of burnt fat. I pulled at the collar of my jacket, a nervous habit, though the fabric was already loose around my neck. My hand instinctively went to my wrist, tracing the cold metal of my old analog watch. It wasn't even for time anymore, just a grounding mechanism, a small, mechanical certainty in a world that consistently pulled the rug out from under me. I told myself it was pre-shift jitters, the usual anxiety of another dead-end job, but the knot in my gut tightened, a familiar premonition that something was about to go sideways. It always did. The closing crew, a trio of tired-looking kids who moved with the grace of sleepwalkers, had finally shuffled out the back door, leaving me to the vast, echoing silence of the empty restaurant. I'd locked every door, double-checked the deadbolts, even peered through the blinds at the darkening parking lot. My checklist was simple enough. Wipe down the sticky tables, mop the greasy floors, take out the overflowing trash bins. Mundane, mind-numbing tasks, exactly what I craved. The rain had started, a soft, insistent drumming against the plate glass windows, creating a hypnotic rhythm that was almost lulling me into a false sense of security. Almost, because even through the drumming, I could hear it now, the faint, high-pitched hum that hadn't been there before, a subtle electrical current flowing through the very air. Then, from the manager's office, the printer burst to life, a sudden, jarring mechanical whir. It ripped through the stillness, a jagged blade of sound, and the green power light, visible through the office door's glass panel, flickered erratically, like a dying firefly. My heart slammed against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. A chill, cold and sharp as splintered ice, raced down my spine, rooting me to the spot by the soda fountain. My first rational thought was some automated test, a leftover print command from the day shift, but the sound, now accompanied by the soft rustle of paper feeding, felt oddly deliberate, like a summons. It wasn't just printing, it was calling to me. Every instinct, finely honed by years of running from things that shouldn't exist, screamed at me to turn, to grab my go bag from the break room, always packed, always by the door, and bolt. But that other, less rational part, that persistent, regrettable sense of responsibility that had dragged me into more holes than I could count, compelled me forward. My fatal flaw, the reason I never quite escaped. I moved cautiously, each step a conscious effort, my worn boots squeaking faintly on the linoleum. The dim glow of the computer monitor bathed the cramped office in a sickly green light, making the shadows writhe and dance. It amplified the tension, turning the mundane space into a theatrical stage for something unseen. On the printer tray, stark against the beige plastic, lay a freshly printed sheet of standard white paper. The ink, still warm to the touch, was a stark, ominous black. It wasn't a daily report, or a schedule, or a supply order. The header, bold and centered, screamed its title: Rules for the Night Shift. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the still damp ink. The paper felt heavier than it should, charged with a strange energy. My eyes, accustomed to scanning for threats, devoured the text. If you hear knocking on doors or windows, turn off all lights and hide. If the temperature drops suddenly, don't look behind you. If the office lights flicker, cover the window and stand still for 30 seconds. If you hear sobbing from the bathroom, don't enter. If you see a woman across the street, don't look away until you hear a knock behind you. Do not answer the phone, ever. The rules lie. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, tracing a path down my temple. My hands, despite my efforts, began to tremble. Each line, with its chillingly specific instructions, seemed to tighten an invisible vice around my chest, making it harder to pull in a breath. My stomach churned, a volatile mix of nausea and dread, as the bizarre instructions painted vivid, horrifying images in my mind. The feeling of being watched, a palpable weight on my back, crept over me. I couldn't shake the sense that something sinister was already here, already lurking in the shadows, just waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. I let out a short, nervous laugh, a dry, humorless sound that felt alien in the silence. "Nice try, kids," I muttered, trying to mask the sudden, sharp spike of fear. Very funny, prank of the year. But the specificity, the sheer audacity of it, unsettled me deeply. Who would go to such lengths for a practical joke? And why? I tossed the paper back onto the desk, watching it flutter down like a dead leaf. All right, I grumbled, more to myself than to the empty room. Point taken. Now back to wiping down tables. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing pulse. But as I stepped out of the office, the air hit me like a physical blow. The sudden, drastic drop in temperature stole my breath. It wasn't a gradual chill, it was an instantaneous plummet, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room and replaced with something pulled from the deepest parts of a winter grave. My breath plumed in front of me, thick and white, just as it had in the hook, confirming the impossible cold. I glanced instinctively at the digital thermostat on the wall near the kitchen entrance. It wasn't just cold, it read a horrifying, impossible 4 degrees. A rule slammed into my mind, fresh off the printer. If the temperature drops suddenly, don't look behind you. Every fiber of my being screamed that command. Don't look. Don't turn around. Just walk away. Get out. Run! But the world-weary fatalism that clung to me like a second skin warred with the primal urge to flee. I was already in it. I knew it. The game had begun, and deep down, somewhere buried under layers of cynicism and self-preservation, that damned, reluctant conscience whispered, "You have to know. You have to see." I felt a strange, irresistible compulsion, a pull stronger than any fear. Slowly, agonizingly slowly. I turned, and that's when I saw her reflection. The polished stainless steel of the freezer door, reflecting the dim lights of the kitchen, showed me not just my own gaunt, terrified face, but the figure standing directly behind me. A woman. Her dress, what was left of it, was tattered and hung in damp shreds. Her hair, long and lank, was plastered to a face that was more skull than flesh. Her eyes were gone, replaced by cavernous, lightless voids that seemed to suck the very hope out of the air. Her mouth was a gaping maw, stretched impossibly wide in a silent scream, and an icy tendril, impossibly long and translucent, reached out, brushing against the back of my neck. It was a phantom touch, but I felt it, every single nerve ending shrieking in protest. My mind screamed not to turn, not to acknowledge her, to keep my back to her reflection and bolt. But I was frozen, rooted in place, my gaze locked on her in the metallic surface. Then her voice came. It wasn't loud, not a shout or a scream. It was a whisper, a sound composed of fractured glass and forgotten prayers, seeping into the marrow of my bones. Why not look at me? My body, already rigid with terror, locked up even further. Every muscle screamed, every nerve ending vibrated, begging for movement, for flight. But fear, absolute and suffocating, had rooted me to the spot. My breath hitched in my throat. I could feel her presence, the impossible cold radiating from her, even though she was only a reflection. The tendril still brushed my neck, a feather-light caress that promised unimaginable horrors. I could feel the cold seeping into my very core, a bone-deep chill that threatened to shatter my teeth. The smell of something ancient and moldering, mixed with the ever-present grease, filled my nostrils. I forced myself to back away, one excruciatingly slow step at a time, my eyes still locked on the reflection, until I was several feet from the freezer door. Only then, with a choked gasp, did I finally force myself to spin around. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. The air was still icy, swirling around me like a hungry ghost. But the figure was gone. My heart pounded, a frantic drum solo in my chest, threatening to burst through my ribs. My head spun, trying to reconcile what I had seen with the empty space before me. Had it been a hallucination? The stress? No. The cold was real. The terror was real. I stumbled back into the manager's office, my hand grabbing the printer, clutching the crumpled list of rules like a lifeline. If this wasn't some elaborate, incredibly cruel prank, then maybe I needed to take it seriously. Maybe these were not rules to be broken, but a chilling instruction manual for survival. The night spiraled into an accelerated nightmare. The old crackling PA system, normally used for announcing order numbers, came to life with a sudden burst of static that made me jump. Then, a melody, a haunting lullaby, its tune eerily warped, like a child's music box left out in the rain, notes dripping with water and decay. Each note was off-kilter, slightly dissonant, as though mocking the innocence it was supposed to convey. It was faintly familiar, dragging up a forgotten scrap of memory from a childhood I barely remembered. Something warm and safe, now twisted into something venomous. The longer it played, the more it sounded like whispers hidden beneath the music, barely audible but impossible to ignore. My skin prickled, and I felt as if the lullaby was pulling me into its sinister rhythm, daring me to stay and listen. The soft, childlike melody, now laced with an adult scream, sent shivers down my spine. My mind raced. If you hear knocking on doors or windows, turn off all lights and hide. No knocking yet, but a lullaby that felt like a prelude to one. I didn't waste another second. I bolted, stumbling slightly on the slick kitchen floor, into the walk-in freezer. The heavy door clanged shut behind me, plunging me into frigid, absolute darkness. I huddled amid stacks of frozen burger patties and lukewarm soda syrup, trembling, my breath misting around me. The freezer's hum was a cold comfort, a barrier against the things that now inhabited the restaurant. Then the knocking started, a rhythmic, insistent thump, thump, thump against the windows of the dining area, growing steadily in intensity. Not just tapping, but deep, resonant impacts that vibrated through the very foundation of the building. Shadows, long and distorted, moved past the frost-covered glass of the freezer's small, circular window. I could hear faint whispers now, carried on the air, begging me, enticing me, to come out, to look. My wristwatch, a useless hunk of metal in the dark, felt cold against my clammy wrist. I twisted the crown, a pointless gesture, trying to find some anchor in the rising tide of panic, when the knocking finally subsided, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. I forced myself to crack open the freezer door. A sliver of light from the dining area spilled in, revealing the ghostly white of my own breath. I slowly pushed the door wider, peering out. The dining area was filled, not with customers, not with people, with figures, pale, translucent, their empty eye sockets locked onto me with an unnerving, palpable intensity. They pressed against the windows, a silent, macabre audience, grinning with impossibly wide mouths that stretched far beyond human capacity. Their forms shimmered, like heat haze off asphalt, distorting the world behind them. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something rotten. Another rule came flooding back into my mind, sharp and clear. Hide under the counter. My legs felt like lead, but I forced them to move. I scrambled under the main service counter, squeezing myself into the cramped space, clutching the crumpled rules list as though it were a crucifix. Outside, the figures grew more frantic, their pale hands slamming against the glass with increasing intensity. The sound was a relentless, bone-jarring rhythm that reverberated through the empty store, each strike seeming to shake the glass to its breaking point. Hairline cracks began to spread across the immense plate glass, catching the flickering light and creating an ominous, spiderweb-like pattern. The sight of the fractured glass, combined with the relentless pounding, made it feel like the figures were moments away from bursting through, from reaching me, and one by one, the lights in the store, already buzzing and flickering, began to die, plunging the room into deeper, oppressive darkness. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one a desperate attempt to pull in enough air. The cacophony of bangs and whispers was a terrifying symphony of despair. The lullaby, which had been playing faintly in the background, abruptly stopped. The pounding on the windows ceased. An eerie, absolute silence descended, heavier and more profound than any silence I had ever known. It pressed in, suffocating, as if the very air was holding its breath. I peeked out from under the counter, my eyes scanning the room, straining to see through the gloom, searching for any sign of movement. The figures were gone, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. The restaurant felt alive, a predatory beast holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake, to emerge from my flimsy hiding spot. My hand was still clutching the rule list. My thumb brushed over the last, chilling line. The rules lie. What did that mean? Were they all a trick? Was I playing right into something's hands? Suddenly, the phone on the counter, the old, greasy landline that hadn't rung all night, let out a piercing, startling trill. The sharp sound made me jump, my head hitting the underside of the counter with a dull thud. My blood ran cold. Do not answer the phone, ever. The rule was clear, but that damnable, reluctant conscience, coupled with a desperate need for answers, for any explanation, warred with my survival instinct. I hesitated, my hand trembling as it hovered over the receiver. Why did they print that rule if it was so important? What if it wasn't one of the them? What if it was the person who put those rules there? Against my better judgment, I reached out, my fingers closing around the cold plastic of the receiver. I lifted it to my ear. Hello? My voice was a choked whisper. A familiar voice spoke on the other end. Not familiar like a friend, but familiar like a ghost you've met before, haunting the edges of your perception. It was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. It's not over. Leo, you need to leave. Now. My heart seized. They knew my name, "Who is this?" I demanded, desperation clawing at my throat. "What's happening? What are these rules? Who are you?" But the line went dead, replaced by a harsh, hollow dial tone. The temperature dropped again, a sudden plunge back into the Arctic chill, making my teeth chatter. And then I felt it, a palpable presence, cold and ancient, directly behind me, even though I was still crouched under the counter. My skin crawled and a cold, clammy hand, heavy and skeletal, brushed against my shoulder. I spun around, my head snapping up, but there was nothing there. Just the suffocating darkness, the lingering cold, and the echoing dial tone of a phone I should never have answered. What felt like hours passed. I remained huddled under the counter, my old watch useless in the blackness, no longer caring about the time. Eventually, the cold began to recede. The oppressive atmosphere slowly lifted. The silence returned, but this time, it felt genuinely empty. The horrors had receded, at least for now, when the owner, a nervous wreck of a man named Frank, found me crouched under the counter at dawn. He was pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot. I rambled incoherent words spilling out about the rules, the figures, the cold. He listened, shaking his head slowly, and muttered something about stress, about me hallucinating. But then I asked him about the rules paper, the one I'd left on his office desk. His face drained of all color. You saw it too?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. His reaction confirmed my worst fears, solidifying the sickening truth. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't stress. Something was profoundly wrong with this place, something beyond my understanding, something that had marked not just me, but perhaps Frank too. The chill returned then, a subtle, creeping cold that slithered beneath my skin. I quit the next morning, walking away from the job and its horrors without looking back. My go bag was already packed. It always was. But the memory lingers, an unshakable shadow that follows me, a constant companion. My nights are haunted by shadows creeping at the edge of my vision and whispers that tickle my ears, refusing to let me rest. Sometimes, when the temperature drops unexpectedly, a suffocating cold grips my chest, and I swear I can hear her voice echoing softly in the silence, a taunt and a plea. "Why not look at me?" The sound sends shivers down my spine, leaving me questioning my sanity, wondering if the line between what's real and what's not has been permanently blurred. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I catch myself reaching for my phone, my hand trembling as I hesitate to dial. A strange mix of dread and longing wells up in my chest, the need for closure clashing with the fear of what I might find. I want answers. I want to know who that voice belonged to, what that last rule meant, but then I remember, the last rule, the rules lie. The weight of those words settles heavily on me, reminding me that even the comfort of answers may be an illusion, another trap waiting to be sprung. Character count 9965. The tang of copper and ozone clung to my tongue, thick and cloying, a taste I knew intimately, one that always presaged the kind of hell ordinary men only saw in their worst nightmares. Blood, not my own, slicked my worn leather jacket, a grotesque abstract art painted by another family's demise. The wail of sirens, growing closer, wasn't a comfort. It was the soundtrack to the end of a world, a chorus of disbelief that would soon be met with the cold, hard proof of what I just witnessed. My hands, still trembling, wanted to reach for the familiar, comforting weight of my old analog watch, but they were clenched, useless fists, sticky and warm. Plug your ears if you hear that jingle, lock your doors, and for God's sake, don't let your children near the truck. The words were a silent scream in my skull, a litany of rules carved into my very being by the last few minutes of impossible horror. But those rules, I knew, were born from the kind of knowledge that came at too high a price I just watched someone else pay in full. It had begun, as these things always did, with a deceptive whisper of normalcy, A sun-drenched afternoon that felt too perfect to be true. I'd been working the graveyard shift at the warehouse on the outskirts of Elmwood for the past month, running down some inventory discrepancies. Tonight was my last night before moving on. Another town, another forgotten job, another futile attempt to outrun the shadow that clung to me like a second skin. I was just taking a detour through a quiet, upper-middle-class suburb, looking for a shortcut back to the main highway. The air was thick with the lazy hum of summer, the kind of quiet that makes you suspicious when you've seen too much. Manicured lawns, two-car garages, the gentle scent of freshly cut grass. It was a picture of suburban bliss, a scene straight out of a damn greeting card. My hand instinctively went to the cool steel of my old wristwatch, tracing the worn edges. 4:30. Time for the kids to be out playing, for the illusion of safety to be at its most potent. That's when the jingle started. Familiar, insidious. The saccharine, tinny melody of an ice cream truck, warbling from unseen speakers. It was that specific tune, the one everyone knows, ingrained in the collective subconscious of childhood. A pleasant, nostalgic sound for anyone else. But for me, it felt like a discordant note in a symphony of dread. My blood ran cold, the kind of chill that sinks past the bone and settles in the marrow. I had no idea why, not then. Just a primal, animalistic certainty that something was profoundly wrong. My grip tightened on the steering wheel of my beat-up sedan, knuckles white. Every hair on my arm stood on end. It was the same prickle I'd felt as a child. Standing on the edge of the woods behind our house, a sense of an unseen presence, a deep-seated wrongness that had always preceded, well, everything. The jingle grew louder, rounding the corner. And then I saw it, a boxy, white truck, emblazoned with the words Mr. Frosty's Ice Cream in cheerful, melting letters. It was pristine, almost unnaturally so, glowing in the afternoon sun. No rust, no dents, no peeling paint. Too perfect. Even from a distance, the vehicle looked less like something that had traversed countless streets and more like a prop, freshly pulled from a freezer box. And the jingle, it was too loud, too clear, assaulting the senses with its cloying cheerfulness. It didn't just play, it piped, a relentless, beckoning siren song that seemed to vibrate in the very air, burrowing into the soft gray matter of anyone within earshot. I watched, a morbid fascination taking hold. As a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, with a mop of blonde hair and eyes the color of a summer sky, bounced excitedly towards it. His father, a man in a polo shirt with a friendly, unassuming air, followed a few paces behind, a fond smile playing on his lips. They were a picture of innocent domesticity, the kind of scene I usually went out of my way to avoid, lest it stir up the bitter ashes of my own buried past. But now it was a tableau of impending doom, lit by the cruel, golden light of the late afternoon. My cynical brain, the one that usually told me to floor it and get out, was screaming at me. Just go. Vance, don't get involved. You know how this ends. But my other half, the reluctant conscience I cursed daily, dug its heels in. It was the same damn impulse that had kept me rooted in that dilapidated house in Sycamore Grove as a kid, when every instinct shrieked to run, to save myself. It was the same stubborn, stupid guilt that made me stop for hitchhikers, or look into the dark places I should have avoided. So, I cut the engine, the sudden silence inside my car amplifying the relentless jingle outside. I watched, my jaw tight, as the truck lumbered to a halt beside the boy, 25 feet away, maybe 30, close enough to see the details, far enough to feel utterly helpless. The father walked up, a relaxed posture, his hands in his pockets. The boy peered up at the menu board, a picture of innocent anticipation. The driver's side window was tinted, impenetrable, no glint of glass, no hint of a face within, just an inky void. And then the serving window scraped open, a sound that shouldn't have been audible from my distance, but it was. A sickening metallic shriek, like abused metal tearing on rusty rollers. The sound vibrated in my teeth, a fingernail drawn down a chalkboard, infinitely amplified. And through that newly opened gap, I saw it. Or rather, I didn't see it. The inside of the truck was drenched in shadow, a black so profound it seemed to devour the brilliant afternoon sunlight, mocking its very existence. It was like looking into a wound in reality, a tear in the fabric of the world where light ceased to exist. A chill, bone-deep and absolute, bit into the air, radiating from the truck, chasing away the summer warmth. My stomach clenched. That familiar cold dread coiled in my gut. This wasn't right. This wasn't just a chill. It was the raw, unnatural cold that came before something truly awful. My mind, a cynical catalog of horrors, flashed to the things I'd glimpsed in the dark corners of the world, the whispers of entities that bled through the veil. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "Run, you idiot! Run!" But I was frozen, my gaze locked on the boy, on the father, on the gaping maw of the truck. The boy, Kyle, sensing something was wrong, that preternatural sixth sense children sometimes possess, turned. His bright blue eyes, wide and innocent, fixed on his father, then on the truck, a tiny flicker of confusion playing on his face. He didn't have time to process it. One moment, he was standing there, vibrant and alive. The next, a grotesque, impossible mass of spider legs exploded from the inky darkness of the serving window. Hairy, jointed feelers, a writhing, seething tangle of nightmare, shot out, coiling around the boy. He was sucked in, not pulled, but vacuumed, like shrink wrap through a powerful industrial cleaner. A sickening whoomp of air escaped his lungs, a sound devoid of a scream, as he snapped backward like a rag doll. His head hit the top of the window frame with a wet crack, lolling unnaturally to the side. And then he was gone, swallowed by the impossible darkness within the truck. A strangled sound tore from my own throat, a voiceless wail of horror and futile rage. My foot slammed on the gas pedal, the tires spitting gravel as my sedan lurched forward. I barely registered the father's guttural scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that would echo in my mind for weeks. My vehicle fishtailed, and I cursed, fighting the wheel. The ice cream truck, meanwhile, began to move, the cheerful jingle still mocking the horror it had just unleashed. I jammed the car into park, leaping out before it had fully stopped, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My worn leather jacket flapped behind me as I sprinted, fueled by a desperate, idiotic surge of that cursed conscience. What was I going to do? I had no plan, just a suicidal need to do something. I reached the truck as it pulled away, my vision blurred with adrenaline and the sickening knowledge of what I was witnessing. I slammed my fist against the side, a dull thud against the cold metal, then grabbed the edge of the serving window, pulling myself up, peering into the impossible void that had consumed the child. The interior of the truck was a spatial anomaly, a gaping, cavernous space that defied all logic. It was not a truck, it was a portal, a vast, echoing abattoir, stretching into an unseen distance. The air inside was thick with the stench of something ancient and metallic, the coppery tang of fresh blood mingling with the cloying sweetness of stale sugar and a faint, indescribable musk of decay. My eyes, ever observant, scanned the horrific panorama. Dilapidated cattle chutes, slick with a glistening, reddish-brown residue, snaked through the darkness, leading to a sprawling plant floor textured with stained, grimy linoleum. It was a factory, a killing floor, designed with an efficient, horrifying purpose. This wasn't some forgotten relic of industry. It was a living, breathing nightmare. And the livestock? Oh God, the livestock. Hundreds of them. Children, Small, pale shapes. Their movements sluggish, listless. Their faces slack and devoid of expression. Their eyes were glazed, empty, like broken dolls. They shuffled along the chutes, caked in their own filth, their small forms dwarfed by the hulking figures that moved among them, figures in blood-stained aprons, their faces obscured by USGI cold weather masks, the kind designed for Arctic conditions. But here, they hid something far colder than ice. They moved with a chilling efficiency, wielding curved knives, opening throats with wet, tearing sounds. There were no screams. That was the worst part. The silence was absolute, broken only by the weak shuffle of small feet, the syrupy slap of blood hitting the floor, and the occasional soft thud of a lifeless body. The dead were hoisted, ankle up, onto a conveyor system that hummed softly in the oppressive darkness. Like at a dry cleaner's, they zipped off through a darkened portal, into the unknown. A hot trail of blood still sprayed from their severed necks, misting the air with a fine crimson spray. I felt a wave of nausea so profound it threatened to buckle my knees. My stomach roiled, a hot rush of vomit threatening to climb my throat. This was it. This was the source, the wellspring of the cosmic dread that had haunted me since Sycamore Grove. The same pervasive evil, operating with a cold, terrifying indifference. It was a familiar flavor of horror, but scaled up, infinitely more ravenous. This wasn't just a monster, it was an industry, a system. As the truck continued to pull away, my grip slipping, a pale, small hand reached out from the gloom. My heart leaped into my throat. It was Kyle, his head pitched at a sickening angle, his eyes dead, vacant, but still, something. A spark, a tiny flicker of recognition, buried beneath the horror. And then, he spoke. A single word, whispered in a voice I would never hear again. A voice stripped of its childish innocence, tinged with a chilling finality. Run! Then, with a sudden, impossible force, he slammed the serving window shut. Just as the gap closed, I saw the massive spider legs encircle him from behind, intertwining like grotesque fingers. They covered his mouth, his eyes, tearing him backward, deeper into the dark, sending him toward the slaughter line. The truck growled up the street, its cheerful jingle echoing, mocking. It turned the corner, the sound fading, and disappeared from view, carrying off the son of a stranger, a child I had tried and failed to save, just like I had failed my own family all those years ago. I stumbled back, landing hard on the asphalt, the sickening crunch of gravel under my spine. The father of the boy was already on his knees, a raw, primal howl tearing from his throat, a sound that mirrored the one I'd heard from my own mother so long ago. He looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant, the gaze of a man whose world had just been ripped apart. I didn't say anything. What could I say? Your son was taken to a meat locker run by multi-limbed horrors? The words would stick in my throat. Useless. The next few hours were a blur of flashing blue and red lights, the guttural mumble of police radios, and the flat, unblinking stares of detectives in cheap suits. The father, a man named Michael, was inconsolable. His wife, Jessica, arriving later, her scream of anguish tearing through the quiet suburban street like a physical wound. She collapsed, wailing for her son, while their daughter, Maya, perhaps 8, clung to her mother's leg, her face a mask of bewildered terror. I stayed in the background, a silent, grim observer. They asked me what I saw. I lied, told them of Mr. Frosty's ice cream truck, exactly as it was. Took him. No spider legs, no impossible interior, no slaughterhouse. They would have locked me in a padded cell. Or worse, accused me of involvement. My word carried no credence. I knew that. My life on the road, my lack of roots, my detached demeanor, it all screamed suspect. They put out a statewide APB. They found nothing. Of course, they found nothing. The night that followed was a black void of despair. I stayed, compelled by that damn conscience, by the echoing scream of the mother. I sat in my car, parked down the street, watching their house, a silent sentinel. Michael and Jessica didn't sleep. Her face was puffy, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. Maya, the younger twin, was smart, too smart for her age. She understood the weight of the silence, the crushing grief that had descended upon their home. She had put herself to bed without fuss, a small, somber ghost in her pink PJ onesie. I was numb, my body cold. A sick lie, I thought, giving them any hope. I knew what I had seen, deep down, in the furthest pit of my stomach. I knew their son, like all those children, was gone, dead. Blindly shuffled up the murder chute to those hulking things in bloody aprons. Around midnight, a small figure appeared in the doorway of their home, silhouetted against the dim light within. Maya, clutching her pink blanket, her eyes wide but not with simple fear. Something else, recognition. A chill snaked up my spine. This wasn't normal grief. This was the prelude to something I knew all too well. Michael, hollow-eyed, looked at his wife. "What?" he mumbled, barely audible. "Jessica," her voice thick with snot and tears, blew into a tissue. "Kyle's out there. We should be looking for him, trying to find that truck." She cut him an accusing glare, the blame a palpable thing between them. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't his. It was the truck's. Then Maya spoke, her voice a thin, reedy whisper that cut through the night, slicing through the remnants of false hope. "He's home, Daddy," she said. "Kyle's home." My blood ran cold. The kind of cold that steals your breath, that leaves your skin clammy and your mind screaming. "No, not this, not again." My hand, trembling, went to my watch. The minute hand seemed frozen. I watched, my heart thundering as Michael and Jessica rushed to the back door. The porch light flickered on, painting the scene in a sickly yellow glow. The thing that came through their back door was not their son. It looked like Kyle. It walked like him, a shambling, mud-caked gait. But it wasn't him, not truly. Its pale skin was streaked with grime, but it was the eyes that froze me, cold and dead. Not the warm, innocent blue puddles they had been, but two icy marbles that seemed to freeze the air around them. There was a knowing, malevolent smile twisting its face, a parody of childish innocence. Jessica sobbed, wrapping the mud-streaked imitation of her son in an embrace. It didn't hug back. Those two cold eyes were pinned on Michael, then on me, a flicker of something ancient and terrible in their depths, as if acknowledging my presence, my curse. "Why'd you do it, Daddy?" The voice was Kyle's, but it was wrong. Too flat, too hollow. They led it into the living room, a family walking into a nightmare. I could feel Maya's body tense up against her mother's, a small, desperate tremor. She knew. She saw it. She knows something bad is about to happen. "What?" Jessica asked, her voice cracking with confusion. "Why'd you try to kill me? Try to kill me, huh, Daddy? Why? I thought you loved me. Dad, I thought you..." Its head reared back impossibly far on its neck, a sickening crackle of cartilage and bone. Its mouth curved into a dark, perfect O, growing wider, impossibly wide. A throaty, gurgling sound emanated from its throat. Its eyes rolled back into their sockets, showing only the whites, like a pair of blind, unseeing orbs. Jessica looked at Michael, her eyes wide with dawning horror, then back at the thing that was supposed to be her son. She started backing up, a slow, terrified shuffle. Michael, too, was frozen, his face ashen. They retreated into the living room, the Kyle thing bearing down on them, forcing them back. Maya had started to sob, clutching her pink blanket to her face, her warm, salty tears soaking her mother's shirt. The O of Kyle's mouth continued to expand, drawing further and further as it spoke again. Only this time, its lips didn't move. And the voice, deeper, warped, like the words of a demon from the mouth of the possessed, came hissing out of its throat. A wet, guttural sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. "Why, Dad? Why'd you fucking do it? You like killing little kids. Dad? Want to kill Maya? Want to see her pigtails wrapped in brain? Stop!" Michael's voice was a weak, thin rasp, lost in the echoing horror. The thing chuckled, a wet, slithering sound, as Kyle's mouth continued pulling back, impossibly wide. Its lips were coated in a glistening bile, thick and viscous. Its teeth were brown and jagged, like broken splinters of ancient bone. Jessica's head snapped between the monstrosity that wore her son's face and her husband, her face a mask of shattered disbelief. Her legs hit the couch, and she crumpled onto the cushion with a surprised gasp. It was lost in the hoarse, demonic voice that had hijacked her son's mouth. "Want to bash her little head in? Hammer it until crumples and all those little girl thoughts and feelings come spilling out?" The corners of the Kyle thing's mouth tore. Rivulets of blood, dark and sluggish, sledded down its throat, staining the front of its mud-streaked shirt. Its mouth continued to pull back, like its head was splitting up on a hinge. Bone and tendons snapping and crackling with sickening wet sounds. The lower half of its face was soaked in its own grotesque blood. "Make him stop, Dad," Maya moaned, her voice muffled by her blanket, a plea for a world that no longer existed. Michael couldn't speak. His voice was lost, swallowed by the terror. His Adam's apple bobbed convulsively, but no sound escaped. The Kyle thing's mouth split wider, wider, the sound of tearing flesh and grinding bone sickeningly loud in the confined space. Its throat distended and undulated, like there was a knot of fingers trying to claw their way out. "Want to be a butcher, Dad?" The voice within the Kyle thing chuckled, a wet, slithering sound that scraped at the raw nerves of my soul. Hack through gristle and vein and the stretch of pink flesh connecting tiny heads to tiny bodies. Feel the warm rush of blood over your hands. Feel your knife scrape bone as they drain. Its words were a poison, meant to break the man, to unravel his sanity. Want to watch the light bleed from their eyes as their life bleeds from their throat? Want to, Dad? Want to? Then, with a final horrific tearing sound, the Kyle thing's head tore back, its cheeks ripping, its mouth forced open in an awful, hellish grin. And the mass of hairy, jointed spider legs exploded from its throat, writhing and snapping into the living room, a sudden, grotesque blooming of pure horror. Jessica started to scream, a high-pitched, piercing shriek of absolute terror. One of the spider legs, thick and segmented, lashed out, batting her across the face with a wet thwack. Her head snapped around, a sickening crackle echoing, and she pitched forward, landing on the couch with the boneless weight of a sack of grain. That galvanized Michael. He let out a wordless roar, galvanized by a primal, desperate surge of fatherly instinct. He flung Maya onto the couch and lurched for the rack of fireplace tools. The spider legs crackled and snapped, flickering around like a net of tendrils from the Kyle thing's broken mouth. Maya was shrieking, a raw sound of pure, childlike terror. The spider legs lunged for her, shooting forward, long and dark, aiming for her delicate, small form. Michael tore the poker free of the fire rack, a heavy, blunted piece of wrought iron. He whipped around, using his forward momentum, bringing the heavy instrument down with as much force as he could muster. A desperate, valiant swing against the impossible. Only he missed. Oh, God, how he missed. Maya, in her childlike terror, had instinctively lunged away from the spider thing trying to kill her. She had lunged right into the arc of her father's swing. The barbed end of the poker hit the center of her skull, not the monster's. and went burrowing into her brain. I heard bones snap like glass, a sickening, wet crack. I saw the poker ease into the spongy folds of her mind. She fell, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, landing face down with a sickening thud. A tiny, strangled sob escaped her lips. Her small hand clenched into a microscopic fist against the patterned rug, and then she died. The Kyle thing began to roar with laughter, a wet, gurgling sound of triumph that was utterly inhuman. It turned on Michael, its spider legs flickering and pulsing, snapping in all directions like 10 of those inflatable dealership tube men, obscenely alive. "You like killing kids, Dad? You like—" Then, a surprised gasp. The spider legs snapped erect, like soldiers at attention, as the animation drained from the Kyle thing's face. Michael, broken by what he had just done, had wrenched the poker free of his daughter's broken mind and, with a final, desperate surge of fury, plunged it into the Kyle thing's left eye. Its ocean blue eyeball deflated, a thin run of viscous, yellow pus running down one cheek. Then the tendril sucked back into its mouth with a final, wet gurgle, and the Kyle thing pitched forward, landing on the floor with a heavy, final thud, as dead as the rest of his family. I stood there on the street, misted in their children's blood, their screams still echoing in my ears. The sight of the slaughtered children inside the truck burned into my retinas. The sirens were closer now, a banshee wail. My hands, still clenched into useless fists, began to tremble uncontrollably. This was my life. This was the curse. To witness, to be drawn in, to be tainted by the horrors that stalked the edges of reality. My own past, the Sycamore Grove incident, felt less like a distant memory and more like a fresh wound, reopened by the agony of these strangers. The ice cream truck, a beacon of childhood joy, had become another testament to the universe's indifference, to the hungry things that preyed on the innocent. I was broken. A man ruined by a summer day, by a haunting jingle, by a glimpse into a darkness I would never truly escape. I'm sure my name would be bolded in the paper, conjoined to some variation of family annihilator or witness to tragedy. But it wasn't me, not directly. I bore the blame. God, how I did. The blame of a man cursed to witness, cursed to carry the knowledge, cursed to be forever pulled towards the very horrors he tried to outrun, and then, forever alone, left to write his warnings. If your kids ask for ice cream, buy them a tub of the store-bought stuff. It's just as good. My only hope, a flimsy, desperate prayer, was that someone, somewhere, would listen and survive. Character count excluding instructions: 9,167 characters. The sickly copper tang of fresh blood clung to the humid Texas night, a metallic perfume that mingled with the acrid scent of ozone and the faint, sweet decay of something else. My gaze locked on the two detached limbs splayed on the dewy lawn, felt like it was tearing at my own retinas. They lay there, impossibly long, pale as bleached bone under the harsh glare of the police floodlights, their hands curled into grotesque, silent questions. A young officer, her face a mask of carefully constructed professionalism, knelt beside them, her gloved fingers gingerly tracing the ragged, impossibly neat cuts at what should have been the elbows. From the porch behind me, I could hear a muffled sob, quickly stifled. Alicia. The night had only just begun its slow, agonizing crawl into the dawn, and already the world had revealed another facet of its bottomless, predatory indifference. It had started, as it always did, with the mundane. 2 months before the arms, before the police tape and the news vans, my life had settled into a rhythm I almost dared to call normal. Just me, Leo Vance, a single father in a quiet Texas suburb, navigating the treacherous waters of bedtime stories, forgotten homework, and the peculiar chaos of raising 2 kids. Alicia, 8, all sharp wit and burgeoning cynicism that frankly made me proud. And Jay, 4, a tornado of boundless energy and, unfortunately, a magnet for nightmares. Their mother had made her grand exit 2 years prior, a masterclass in vanishing acts, leaving behind a void that I'd filled with lukewarm coffee and an endless rotation of night shifts, ensuring I was always there for the mornings. We lived in a 2-bedroom house that smelled faintly of old wood and kid-sized anxieties. A place I'd hoped would be a sanctuary, a temporary one, of course. Nothing was ever permanent for me. It never could be. The first tremor in this fragile piece came not from a tremor at all, but from a persistent, insistent poke to my cheek one moonless night. Jay. He was a small, shaking bundle of terror, his tiny body racked with sobs. My internal alarms, usually set to catastrophic, merely registered minor distress. Jay was prone to these midnight visitations from phantom monsters. "Bad dream, kiddo?" I mumbled, my voice thick with sleep, the familiar weight of Buster, my scruffy terrier mix, shifting on the foot of the bed. Buster, a veteran of my increasingly bizarre life, merely sighed, a low rumble of canine discontent. He was a creature of comfort, a furry anchor in a world that consistently tried to unmoor me. "The man," Jay choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "The man in the next house." Scary faces. My eyes, which usually saw only the shadows of my own fatigue, sharpened. This wasn't the usual monster under the bed. There was a specificity to it, a lack of fantastical embellishment that prickled the hairs on my neck. The neighbor, Old Man Henderson, I thought, a recluse. Barely seen him in the 3 years I'd owned the place. Beyond a quick nod across the fence, nothing about him suggested malice. But then again, nothing about Ethan or Olivia had suggested malice either. My stomach coiled, a familiar, unpleasant sensation. The world was already trying to remind me of its true nature. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The worn leather of my jacket, slung over the chair, seemed to sag in sympathy. I didn't need to put it on. I just needed to feel its presence. My hand instinctively went to my old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick. The crystal was scratched, the metal warm from my skin. It wasn't about the time, it was about the ritual, the small mechanical certainty in a world that offered none. "Come on, Jay man," I said, my voice softer than I intended. We padded down the short hallway to the kids' room. The nightlight cast a faint, almost ethereal glow, illuminating Alicia in her top bunk. Arms crossed, a scowl etched onto her face. Even in distress, she was a Vance through and through. "He's always crying," she grumbled, a miniature version of my own world weariness. "I never get any sleep. Dad, it's not fair." Jay, naturally, dissolved into fresh tears, a familiar script. I didn't bother turning on the main light. The ambient street lamp glow, filtered through the narrow gap in the curtains, was enough. I approached the window. Their room shared a wall with Old Man Henderson's place, and 2 windows on his side were visible from here. The one closest to the street, I knew, was his kitchen. The other, further back, always had its curtains drawn tight. "Alicia," I whispered, "did you see anything?" She shook her head, still glaring at her brother. "Nope, just Jay being a crybaby." It was enough to make Jay burble anew. I sighed, the sound a ragged breath in the quiet room. All right. Come on, Jay. You can camp in my room tonight." His TMNT tent was already folded in the corner, a relic of countless other nightmares. I was a pushover. I knew it. But the thought of him, alone in this room, while some unseen presence leered from the house next door, no, not tonight. For the next 2 nights, Jay slept in his tent on my bedroom floor. The house felt heavier, the air thick with unspoken dread. I found myself checking the kids' window, the neighbor's house. Every time I passed, nothing. just the impenetrable darkness of his unlit windows. I almost convinced myself it had been a true nightmare, a childish fantasy. Almost, my cynicism, usually a sturdy shield, felt thin. The third night, my sleep, a shallow pool at best, was shattered not by Jay's sobs, but by Alicia's insistent shaking. She stood over me, a spectral figure in the faint moonlight, her small hand clamped on my forearm. This was unprecedented. Alicia hadn't woken me in the middle of the night since she was a toddler, a distant memory of scraped knees and lost teddy bears. My heart rate, usually a lazy drum, picked up a frantic, uneven beat. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The neighbor. He was making faces." The words were a hammer blow. My blood ran cold, a familiar Arctic current, Jay's dream. That was not a dream. It was a premonition, a warning. "Alicia, sweetie." I tried to keep my voice even, steady, but the lie tasted like ash. "I closed the curtains when I tucked you in. Did you open them?" She nodded, a jerky motion. "Only a little, but it's 'cause I heard a weird noise." "What kind of noise?" She frowned, searching her memory. "It was a quiet noise, and then a light." She described how she crept out of bed, drawn to the sound like a moth to a flickering flame. When she'd pulled back the curtain, just a sliver, she'd seen it. A dim light in the neighbor's back room, the one with the perpetually drawn curtains, and then a figure standing right up against the window, pressing his face to the glass. What was he doing? My throat felt dry, constricted. I knew the answer, even before she showed me. Alicia paused, her small brow furrowed in concentration. Then, she demonstrated. Her lips stretched into a sickeningly wide, forced smile, revealing both rows of tiny teeth, a sliver of darkness between them. Her eyebrows furrowed, creating a deep crease above her nose. She tilted her head, a peculiar, almost dislocated angle, reminiscent of a twisted doll. Her neck muscles strained, cords of tension. But it was her hands that truly stole the breath from my lungs. She extended her left arm, forearm up, rigid. Then, with her right hand clenched into a fist, she moved it back and forth rapidly over her forearm, a frantic, almost desperate motion. "Playing the violin," she mumbled, her eyes wide, unblinking. The world tilted. The air in the room seemed to congeal, thick and heavy with unspoken horror. That grotesque pantomime of self-harm, enacted for my 8-year-old daughter. The sheer, audacious depravity of it. It wasn't just disturbing, it was an act of pure, distilled, malicious intent. My gut churned. This wasn't a deranged neighbor. This felt different. The kind of wrongness that had a deeper root, like the silence that had followed me down that snow-choked mountain pass, or the chilling perfection of Olivia's smile before she tried to add me to her collection. It was the same unsettling wrongness I'd felt when Ethan had offered me that glass of water, his eyes too bright, too empty. "Stop," I said, my voice a harsh whisper. "Alicia, stop. Don't ever do that again. Don't make that face. Don't make that gesture." The words felt inadequate, a futile attempt to erase the memory of what I'd just seen from my child's innocent mind. I pulled her into a hug, feeling her small, shaking body against mine. My reluctant conscience, that cursed internal mechanism I usually tried to bury under layers of sarcasm and self-preservation, flared to life. This wasn't just a weirdo, this was a threat. To my kids, we talked for a few more minutes. She insisted she hadn't seen any other gestures. The beckoning motion Jay had described, the "come here" movement, she hadn't witnessed. That was a small mercy, I supposed, a thin sliver of light in a rapidly darkening tunnel. I brought Alicia to my room, tucking her into Jay's tent, a decision I made without a second thought. My protective instincts, so often dormant, had been violently jolted awake. I checked their window again. peered out into the impenetrable darkness of Old Man Henderson's house. Nothing. Just the silent, oppressive blackness. The kind of silence that precedes a scream. The next morning, after dropping the kids at school, a grim resolve settled over me. This wasn't something I could ignore, not if it involved my children. It wasn't against the law to be a creepy neighbor, but this was beyond creepy. This was predatory. I parked my beat-up truck in my driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled, and walked with purpose to Henderson's front door. His sedan was parked there, a dull, unremarkable gray, suggesting he was home. I knocked, and then I knocked again, harder this time. The porch light, still on in the morning sun, seemed to mock me. 5 minutes I stood there, my fist bruising against the solid wood, the silence of the street pressing in on me. No answer. Just as I turned to leave, a flash of movement in the front window, a glimpse, a pale face, startled eyes framed by drawn curtains, before it ducked, quick as a lizard. The coward. My blood boiled. "Hey!" I roared, my voice raw, echoing down the quiet street. "Stop messing with my kids, you hear me? Leave them alone!" Shit, the words felt hollow, impotent against the silence of the house. I walked away, my shoulders hunched, the worn leather of my jacket feeling suddenly heavy, like a shroud. That night, Friday night, I put my plan into motion. The kids were tucked into my room, both of them sharing Jay's tent, a strange little encampment. Buster was curled at the foot of my bed, a furry sentinel. I made sure every window was locked, every curtain drawn tight, every door bolted. Then, I retreated to the kids' room, my vantage point. I sat on the floor, beneath their window, my back against the wall, phone in hand. Midnight Mass was playing on low volume, the subtitles flickering on the screen, a mundane distraction against the growing dread. I didn't want headphones. I needed to hear everything. Every creak, every sigh of the settling house, every whisper of the wind outside. The wait was agonizing. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the slow, inexorable march of my wristwatch's second hand. My gaze kept drifting to the window, to the narrow gap in the curtains, a sliver of blackness that felt like an abyss. Around midnight, the first sound cut through the oppressive silence, a low, repeated clicking. Chick, 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 chick. It was like the sound you make to call a horse, a soft, intimate sound, but distorted, made sinister by its context, undeniably human. It resonated through the thin walls, vibrating in my chest. My breath hitched. This was it. A few minutes later, the clicking ceased, replaced by a strange, whistling sound. It wasn't a whistle, not really. More like air being sucked through clenched teeth. A wet, sibilant hiss, crisp, too crisp, as if the window across the way was open. The thought made a cold knot form in my stomach. 15 feet. That was all that separated us. 15 feet of dark, humid night. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was my chance to confirm, to see what unspeakable thing had been plaguing my children. My hand went to my watch, tracing the cold glass, a futile attempt to ground myself. Then, I pushed off the wall, my legs stiff, and in one fluid motion, I reached for the curtain, pulled it back. He was there. A dim light glowed behind him, casting his form in a sickly yellow hue, and the face. Alicia's recreation had been disturbingly accurate, but seeing it on an adult, a fully grown man, was a different order of horror entirely. The stretched smile, the furrowed brow, the head cocked at that unnatural angle. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. His window was indeed open, a black rectangle in the dim light, and his arms were extended, thrust out into the night air. They were thrashing, swiping against each other with a violent, rhythmic motion, a sickening mimicry of self-mutilation. My blood roared in my ears. The air was sucked from my lungs. For a suspended moment, he didn't see me. He continued his grotesque pantomime, his eyes fixed on the empty space where my children's bed should have been. Then, his gaze flickered, shifted, and he saw me, a grown man, standing sentinel in the dark. Not a terrified child. The cartoonish grin melted, dissolved, replaced by something colder, harder. Rage, pure, unbridled fury contorted his features. His body stiffened. His arms, still extended into the night, froze. Then, with a speed that startled me, he lunged for the window, a violent slam. The glass rattled in its frame. Then, the curtains were ripped shut with the same furious force. My own curtains slipped from my nerveless fingers, falling back into place, plunging me back into the comforting, relative darkness. I stood there, shell-shocked. The image of his face, the raw hatred in his eyes, burned behind my eyelids. I was perturbed, yes, deeply disturbed by the sight of him, by the sheer audacity of his malice. But another detail, a far more unsettling one, had begun to claw at the edges of my consciousness. As his face contorted in rage, I had seen him clearly, and I wasn't entirely sure. That was old man Henderson. The face had been too gaunt, the eyes too hollow, too utterly devoid of recognition. Henderson was a recluse, yes, but not this. I'd seen him, 3 or 4 times in 3 years. A fleeting glimpse across the fence, a quick wave from his driveway. Could I really say with certainty that the man I'd just seen was the same man? The unsettling question settled in my gut, a cold, leaden weight. How many times had I seen a face, a seemingly normal face, only for the monster beneath to rear its head? Ethan, Olivia, they had worn human skin so perfectly. I sank back to the floor, my blood still thundering in my ears, a frantic, desperate drum. My hand went to the reassuring weight of my old analog wristwatch, twisting the crown. My mind raced. Evidence. I had more than enough now. The police. I reached for my phone. Just as my fingers brushed the cold glass of the screen, a tremendous smack against the window. The glass shivered in its frame, a loud, concussive blow that vibrated through the floorboards. My breath caught in my throat. My head snapped up. A brief hesitation. Common sense screamed at me to stay still, to not engage. But my cursed conscience, that fatal flaw, overrode it. My hand reached out, pulled the curtain back, just enough to peer through the sliver. Nothing. The neighbor's house was plunged back into darkness. No lights, no movement, no figure at the window, just the black, impenetrable rectangle of glass. I pulled the curtain back further, letting more moonlight spill into the room, and then I saw it, in the top corner of the window pane, a handprint, large, smeared, distinct. Our house was on a raised foundation, the window impossibly tall. To reach that height, a man would need an insane vertical, a leap that defied human anatomy. Unless he wasn't a man. A cold dread, deeper than anything I'd felt tonight, settled over me. This wasn't just a psycho neighbor. This was something else, something unnatural. My mind flashed back to the impossibility of the hitchhiker, to the way the dead shouldn't move, to the silent, predatory grace of the skin carpet lady. The world was shrinking, and the impossible was becoming increasingly common. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and dialed 911. Yes, I gasped, my voice thin, reedy. My neighbor. He's harassing my children. And now he's outside my window. I kept my voice low, just above a whisper, even as I spoke to the dispatcher. As I explained, I moved, quickly, silently. My feet pounded softly on the carpeted floor as I circled the house, checking every window, every door. A quick, frantic patrol, looking for a shadow, a movement, anything that would give away its presence. Nothing. The house was an island of quiet, our only company the frantic thumping of my own heart. My last stop was my bedroom. I slipped inside, closing the door softly behind me, locking it with a decisive click. The dispatcher was still on the line, her voice a calm, practiced drone. "Sir, can you confirm your address?" Yes, I already told you," I mumbled, my eyes scanning the room. My hand went to the safe in my closet, a familiar, well-oiled movement. My old 9mm, loaded, ready. I pulled it out, the cold steel a heavy, comforting weight in my palm. My heart hammered against my ribs, threatening to burst free. "Stay calm, Leo, stay calm." And then I saw her, Alicia. Her small face was peering out from the opening of Jay's tent, her eyes wide, unblinking. She hadn't been asleep. She'd heard everything. I lowered the gun, just slightly, keeping it aimed at the door. "We're okay, sweetie," I whispered, my voice rough. "Just be very, very quiet." Her eyes were fixed on the gun, on me. I saw the fear, the confusion, and the nascent understanding. I sat on the edge of my bed, the gun steady in my hand, my ears straining against the heavy silence of the room. The kids' tent was a small, green hummock in the corner. To the left, directly across from where I sat, was the window. My gaze was fixed on it, on the thin, white curtains that obscured whatever lay beyond. The night was cloudless, the moon a brilliant, almost cruel disk in the inky sky. Its light, filtered through the fabric, cast a faint, almost ethereal glow on the curtains. And then, a shadow, nebulous at first, a shifting, indistinct blot against the white. It moved, closer, it filled the space, becoming more defined, a silhouette. It knew exactly where we were. It stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity, a dark, silent sentinel. My hand tightened around the grip of the gun, my knuckles white, my eyes burned, fixed on the impossible shape. I was thankful, profoundly, sickeningly thankful, that Alicia, from her angle inside the tent, couldn't see it, couldn't see this. Then it moved, took a step back from the glass, and raised its arms, a Y shape. The silhouette stretched, elongated, but its arms, they were wrong, impossibly long, double the length they should have been. Each arm, it seemed, was the same length as its entire body. My mind, desperate for a rational explanation, screamed pipes. 2 pipes held in its hands. But no, as it brought them closer to the window, the moonlight, however faint, showed me 2 hands, at the ends of the extremities, 5 fingers on each, flopping, wriggling slightly, like disturbed worms. My finger moved to the trigger guard. This wasn't human. This wasn't Old Man Henderson. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Thud. A dull, wet impact against the glass. Thud. Louder this time. A bone-jarring vibration. Thud. The sound of shattering glass was imminent. I stood, bringing the gun up, steadying my aim. Just then, the shrill, blessed wail of sirens ripped through the quiet night, distant at first, then growing louder, closer, a cacophony of hope and professional intervention. The thing at the window paused. Its head, a dark, featureless oval, seemed to tilt, one last, resounding bang against the glass, a final act of defiance. And then, it was as if someone had taken an invisible blade and sliced through its arms at the elbows. The forearms, impossibly long, impossibly real, seemed to shear right off. They separated from the main body, falling like grotesque, dead weights. And the thing, The monstrous silhouette spun on its heel and sprinted into the darkness before the severed limbs had even hit the dewy ground. A beat of stunned silence. Then, a voice amplified by a megaphone cut through the night. "Police, open up! We're responding to a 911 call!" I holstered the gun, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I walked to the front door, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden quiet of the house. 2 officers, a man and a woman, stood on my porch, their faces grim, professional, I explained, my words tumbling out in a rush, disjointed, probably sounding like the ramblings of a madman. They asked questions, their eyes impassive, taking notes, necessary, I supposed, for probable cause. "Stay inside, sir," the female officer instructed, her voice flat. "Keep the doors locked. We'll investigate." I watched them from the kids' room window. They walked to Henderson's front door, knocked. No answer. The male officer tried the handle. It turned. The door swung inward with a soft creak, revealing a maw of impenetrable darkness. They exchanged a glance, then entered, their flashlights cutting twin beams through the gloom. I waited. The minutes stretched, interminable, laced with the metallic taste of fear. What would they find? The answer came sooner than I expected. They emerged, moments later, their faces stripped of their professional composure, the grim set of their jaws, the wide, disbelieving eyes. They hadn't found what they expected. I walked outside, drawn by a morbid curiosity, the desperate need for answers. What did you find?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The female officer, her gaze fixed on something beyond me, answered, her voice tight, strained. "Your neighbor. He's dead." The rest of the night was a blur. Uniformed strangers moving with purpose. A ballet of grim efficiency. Forensics vans. Flashing lights painting the quiet street in hues of red and blue. Each person who approached me on my porch asked questions, but no one offered answers. Their faces were shuttered, their words clipped. I wandered to the side of the house, drawn by the cluster of figures, the harsh glare of flashlights, and that's where I saw them. 2 human arms, lying on the dewy grass outside my bedroom window. The sight was even more horrific up close. The cuts, so precise, the impossible length, and then I knew. The thing that had been at my window, the thing that had mimicked my neighbor, had dropped its trophies. The real old man Henderson was gone. The thing that had occupied his house, his space, his life, was not human. It was an imposter. We've been staying at my parents' apartment for months now. The air is thick with unspoken anxieties. The space too small for a family of 3 plus a dog. Jay complains about the cramped quarters. Alicia is withdrawn, haunted by the images seared into her young mind. I try to sell the house, but the story somehow, inevitably, went viral. It's impossible to shake. Dismemberment, days of torture, victim barely recognizable as human. Words that cling to the property like a stain, a permanent, grim monument to the unspeakable. Who wants to buy a house, even a good house, in a quiet neighborhood, when it comes with a built-in history of an imposter, a monster that wears human skin, and the chilling certainty that the line between human and something else is thinner than any of us dare to admit? I am trapped, again, trapped by the consequences of things I never sought, by the horrors that continue to find me, no matter how far I run. The buzzing is a song of madness, a choir of tiny, chitinous wings beating against the glass of my sanity. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, a living, writhing blanket of black and green draped over my window, each one a tiny, multifaceted eye staring in. Their collective shadow ripples and writhes, tendrils of impossible darkness stretching and retracting, hungry and patient. I can feel their awareness, a cold, predatory intelligence seeping through the glass, through the flimsy tape I've used to seal the cracks, right into my bones. They know I can see them, And now, they want in. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about avoiding becoming part of the scenery, another victim absorbed into the rot. The red light of the evening sun, filtered through their undulating mass, paints my room in the sickly hue of a wound that refuses to heal. That moment, pressed against the flimsy barricade of my own fear, was the bitter fruit of 2 years of unraveling. 2 years since the world decided to rip off its polite disguise and show me the ugly truth it had always hidden. It all started, as these things often do, with an ordinary Tuesday, a truck, and the brief, icy kiss of death. It was a Tuesday, late. The highway hummed with the monotonous drone of exhausted commuters. I was heading home from another soul-numbing night shift, just another cog in the machine of transient, anonymous labor. Then the truck, a blur of chrome and diesel, thundering past too fast, too close. There was a shriek of tortured metal, a sickening lurch that threw me against the seatbelt, and the world outside my windshield folded in on itself like a cheap suit. The last thing I knew was the sickening crumple of the roof, a dull, final thud against my skull, and then, mercifully, nothing. They said I died on the operating table for 95 seconds. Not long enough for pearly gates. Not long enough for a proper out-of-body experience. Just a cold, crushing blackness that tasted of ash and ozone. It wasn't peaceful, more like being submerged in stagnant water, sensing vast, indifferent things moving just beyond the edge of perception. Things that brushed against my non-existence without acknowledgement. 95 seconds. Maybe that was just enough to scramble my wiring, to rip a hole in whatever delicate membrane shielded me from the world's true face. Or maybe it just finally opened the floodgates to something that had always been lurking. Something I'd unknowingly run from since the smoke cleared from Sycamore Grove all those years ago. 8 months. That's how long I floated, a ghost in my own body, tethered to beeping machines in a sterile tomb. They said I'd never wake, never walk again. Every dire prediction they made felt less like a prognosis and more like a dare. I was still Leo Vance, but the old me was gone, replaced by a weary husk, haunted by a dread I couldn't yet name. This wasn't the first time I'd felt that gnawing fear, that sense of being watched from the shadows. The memory of Sycamore Grove, a phantom limb of terror from a childhood I barely remembered, still twitched and burned at the edges of my thoughts. Another scar on a soul already riddled with them. When I finally bullied them into discharging me, I shuffled out of that hospital like a man twice my age, a cane my unwelcome companion, my head a persistent drum solo of dull aches and dizzy spells. The city was a dizzying assault of colors and sounds, too bright, too loud. Home, an empty house, stripped bare by a wife who'd apparently interpreted "till death do us part" with a 95-second clause. Can't blame her. 8 months is a long time to wait for a vegetable to sprout. At least she'd been considerate enough to pack my worn leather jacket, a second skin, a comforting weight that's seen more horrors than most people twice my age. I managed to rent a small flat, just another temporary stop on a journey I didn't know how to end. Anita, a nurse, visited 3 times a week, a beacon of forced cheerfulness. In those early days, I slept 18 hours a day. The world outside my window a blurry, indistinct threat I dared not face. Deliveroo was my lifeline, the digital equivalent of a hand reaching into my lonely bunker. My old analog wristwatch, a relic from a simpler time, became a nervous tick. I'd check it constantly, not for the time, but for the comforting click of the minute hand, a small, mechanical certainty in a world that was becoming increasingly unhinged. I used to study brains, knew how they worked, how they filtered the tidal wave of reality. Now, mine was broken. The doctors just mumbled about irreparable brain damage, but they didn't understand the half of it. My brain, once the meticulous gatekeeper of perception, was now an open wound. The world was bleeding through. Headaches were constant. My mind, a buzzing, disjointed mess, Could barely focus for more than a few minutes at a stretch. They pumped me full of psychostimulants and antipsychotics, trying to glue my mind back together, to rebuild the walls of my perception. It brought a fragile peace. It dulled the edges, softened the assault. But it was a temporary truce. The truce ended on a Thursday. Anita rang the bell just after noon, a familiar, cheerful chime. I opened the door, and there it was, a maggot, gray, sluggish, about 3 centimeters long, clinging to her right cheek. It wriggled, slowly. My stomach clenched, bile rising in my throat. I tried to sound casual. You've got something on your cheek." Her reaction was chillingly normal. "Oh," she said, almost bored, and absently wiped at her face. All she did was nudge the thing slightly to the side. It was still there, a pale, squirming obscenity against her skin. She didn't see it. She couldn't see it. She even checked her reflection in the hall mirror, straightened her uniform, and looked utterly satisfied. Then, without another word, she proceeded to take my vitals. That was the longest half hour of my life. My eyes, locked onto that wriggling horror, refused to budge. Every time she moved, every time her head turned, I expected the thing to drop, to land on me, to spread its festering reality onto my own skin. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. When she finally declared me coming along nicely, though your eyes are a little dilated, I nearly laughed. Of course they were dilated. They'd just spent 30 minutes watching a maggot dance on her face. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, fatigue, maybe a hallucination left over from the meds. I went to bed, hoping to sleep it off, to wake up to a world that made sense. It didn't. Friday morning, I craved real food, a local shop, 10 minutes walk, a simple errand. The bell above the door jangled as I pushed it open. What I wasn't prepared for was the smell. A sickening, sweet stench of decay hit me like a physical blow, a wave of putrefaction that made my eyes water and my gorge rise. I gagged, forcing myself to push through the miasma, cereal secured. I moved to the fruit section, drawn by the intensifying stench. It was the source. Every piece of fruit, every apple, banana, and orange was a grotesque parody of itself. Gray and green mold bloomed like hideous flowers, fuzzy and wet. The bananas were black, soft, weeping sickly liquid. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this was the truth behind the cheerful displays. This was what the world truly offered. "Helen," I called, my voice raspy, to the woman behind the counter. "What's up with the fruit?" She looked over, her expression blank. "What do you mean?" "It's rotten," I insisted, gesturing weakly. She shuffled out, moving with a practiced indifference that made my skin crawl. She picked up a few apples. They looked more like shapeless, furry blobs from behind a handwritten sign. She turned them over in her hands, her fingers brushing the fuzz, utterly unfazed. "Yeah, I'll chuck these. Bring whatever you want to the counter. I'll check them for you." I left with only the cereal. The scent of decay followed me home, a foul perfume that seemed to cling to my clothes, to my hair, to my very skin. The world outside, already a source of muted dread, was becoming a living nightmare. I became a hermit again, retreating into my flat, trying to process what I was seeing. My stubborn, analytical mind fought against the rising tide of horror. I read everything: science, spiritualism, anything that might explain. My medication, the chemical glue they were using, what if it was hiding something? What if stopping it would reveal more? It was a desperate gamble, reckless. But what was sanity worth if it meant living in a gilded cage of lies? I tapered off, a nightmare of pounding temples and a mind tearing itself apart at the seams. But I pushed through, driven by a perverse need to know, to see the world unvarnished, no matter how ugly. A couple of weeks later, after enduring 2 more visits from Anita, her shadow now more defined, her maggots more numerous, my dread a cold knot in my stomach, I ventured out again. It was a Wednesday, early afternoon. The street was quiet, thankfully devoid of the usual daytime bustle. The trees that lined the street were gnarled, skeletal things, their few remaining leaves sickly, covered in aggressive fungal growths. Their trunks were split, gaping wounds from which ugly, bulbous mushrooms sprouted, oozing some viscous, dark liquid. They looked like dying, cancerous organisms, slowly rotting from the inside out. The road signs, once crisp and clear, were faded to illegibility, rust blooming like a disease across their surfaces. The asphalt itself was a patchwork of cracks, fissures, and gaping potholes, many filled with a thick, viscous liquid that looked like mud but shimmered with an unnatural, oily slime. I instinctively recoiled, a primal revulsion that transcended mere disgust. The houses, my neighbors' homes, were crumbling husks. Walls sagged, paint peeled in long, leprous strips, revealing raw, exposed wood that looked soft and worm-eaten. One house, bearing a jaunty to let sign, had its roof completely caved in, a dark maw leading into unseen depths. Another, inexplicably, was freshly painted, a jarring contrast of pristine white against crumbling brick and splintered wood. But even on that one, the new paint was already starting to blister, to peel, as if the underlying decay was asserting its dominance. It looked like a street abandoned for decades, a post-apocalyptic film set. A chilling thought occurred to me. I stumbled back into my flat, grabbed my phone, and pointed its lens at the street outside. I snapped a photo. Then I stood there, comparing the vibrant, normal image on my phone screen to the grotesque reality my eyes saw. One of them was lying, and I knew, with a bone-deep certainty. It wasn't my eyes, my ruined brain. The shattered filter was simply showing me what had always been there, hidden behind the comforting veil of normalcy. It was a truth too hideous to bear, a reality that would drive most people to the asylum. I tightened my grip on my wristwatch, the cool metal a small anchor in the storm of my thoughts. No, not me, not yet. I had survived Sycamore Grove. I had survived the truck. I would not let myself be confined to a padded cell, not when I was the only one who could see the truth. I'm no academic, but I am a survivor, and survivors observe. They collect data. So, that's what I did. I took my phone, a small notebook, and a clipboard, and walked into town, an unwitting explorer into a world that had always been there, just out of sight. Without the filters, the world was a cacophony of horror. I passed people, each one surrounded by the shadowy auras I'd seen on Anita. But now, with my mind unclouded by meds, I could see them with horrifying clarity. They were roughly human-shaped, like a second, rippling skin, but they pulsed and shifted, tendrils of black translucence whipping out from their forms. From across the street, I could make out the finer details. These weren't emanating from the people, but rather burrowing into them, like parasitic worms, unseen by their hosts, feeding on something vital. The cold dread from Sycamore Grove resurfaced, a metallic taste in my mouth. This felt like that, an insidious, unseen force, preying on the unaware. I found a quiet bench in the shopping center, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid drawing attention. I tried taking photos, but the phone still saw only the mundane. So I sketched, a habit I'd picked up recently, a way to anchor myself, to give the terrors a physical form outside my head. I drew the auras, the tendrils. They were everywhere, thickest around the head and heart, places of thought and lifeblood. The flies. I'd noticed them earlier, buzzing around people, but hadn't paid them much mind. Now, as I sketched, they seemed more prevalent, more deliberate. They weren't just random insects, As I finished a sketch of a particularly noxious-looking aura, I decided to head home. My apartment, for all its crumbling interior, felt like the only safe haven. My path home was west. The sun had been in my eyes on the way there, so it was an unnatural shock to see another sun, crimson and half the size of the familiar yellow orb, hanging in the eastern sky. Two suns, one the comforting yellow, the other a blood-red eye watching from the east. Had it always been there? Always, but hidden from my brain. Dismissed as irrelevant data? Just another layer peeled back. I sketched both suns, a hurried, shaky drawing, before quickening my pace. My flat, normally a sanctuary, now echoed the decay outside. The walls, once pristine, revealed damp patches and moss-lined cracks, like spiderwebs woven from shadow and rot. The furniture, that sparse collection I'd managed to acquire, looked like rotting wood, its fibers visibly disintegrating. The kitchen reeked, a deep, pervasive stink of something long dead. I threw out every scrap of fresh food, replacing it with cans and ultra-processed junk and bottled water. The tap water was brackish, tainted brown, a muddy soup I wouldn't touch. Anita arrived precisely on schedule the next day. The shadowy aura around her was undeniable now, thicker, more active, like a disturbed beehive. I counted 3 maggots this time, one on her cheek, 2 writhing in her hair. Flies, the same unnaturally large ones I'd seen in town, buzzed around her, dancing in and out of the shadow aura. I kept my eyes closed during her examination, grateful for the sterile gloves that were the only barrier between her reality and mine. The stench of decay radiating from her was almost unbearable. Physically fine, emotionally agitated, she declared, cheerful as ever. No shit, I thought, my jaw clenched. She tried to schedule an inpatient appointment, but I just nodded. Anything to get her out. I had no intention of going. The TV, bless its digital heart, was still normal. Whatever horrors my eyes now perceived, the camera couldn't capture. I spent the rest of the day binge-watching junk, desperate for any semblance of normalcy, any reminder of the world I'd lost. The next day, a desperate plan formed. I needed a closer look at these things, and the doctor's office, a place of supposed authority and sterile environment, felt like a controlled experiment. I called, feigned an emergency, my antipsychotics had run out, and secured an immediate appointment. 2 suns painted the sky a bruised purple as I drove, waiting in my car until the last possible moment, steeling myself. The receptionist, a smiling woman whose skin seemed to barely cling to the bones of her face, ushered me in. The doctor, a short, balding man, sat behind his desk. His white coat, if it had ever been white, was now a tapestry of stains, a collection of forgotten filth. Months, or just days. I couldn't tell. His aura was more pronounced than Anita's, a turbulent storm of black tendrils constantly snaking about him, burrowing into his skin as if it were air. His face, up close, was a roadmap of blemishes and weeping sores I hadn't seen before. And the flies, 6 of them, huge, black and green, buzzing around him, dipping into and out of his aura, dragging wisps of it with them. I could feel the cold radiating from them, a profound chill that settled in my teeth, while he fiddled with his computer, asking me routine questions I barely registered. I pulled out my notebook. I needed to sketch one of the flies. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, 4 or 5 centimeters across, too big for common houseflies. Their bodies were black with iridescent green stripes. 4 wings, not 2, and 4 legs at the back, not 6. 2 grasping limbs at the front, like tiny, prehensile arms. And their eyes, not compound, but 2 unsettling orb-like eyes on stalks, swiveling independently, watching me. This wasn't an insect I knew. This wasn't from my world. Then, two of them landed on my notebook, right on the page, beside my hurried sketch. They paused, their stalked eyes swiveling, seemingly studying the drawing, and then they buzzed. Not just the drone of wings in flight. This was different. A low, modulated hum, distinct, like communication, like they were talking about what they saw, about me. My blood ran cold. They knew. Until then, I had been an observer, an unacknowledged anomaly. But now, they knew I could see them. They rose, joining the others, hovering about half a meter from my face. 10, maybe 11 of them. A buzzing, staring tribunal, their stalked eyes fixed on me. I didn't wait for a verdict. Without a word to the doctor, I bolted. My legs, still not fully recovered, burned with the effort. I ran blindly through the waiting room, out into the too-sunned afternoon, scrambling into my car, the engine roaring to life. I drove, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and them. I reached my flat, slammed the door, and began a frantic, desperate ritual of sealing myself in. Clothes shoved under door frames, duct tape plastered over air vents, towels stuffed into every conceivable crack. Anything to keep them out. Of course, a terrified man fleeing a doctor's office without his meds tends to draw attention. 2 hours later, the police arrived, their knock rattling my fragile barricade. I spoke to them through the living room window, trying to sound calm, rational. They were just doing their job, checking on a patient who'd gone off the rails. I convinced them I wasn't an immediate threat, and eventually, with a shrug and a final, lingering look, they left. Their flies, however, did not. A dozen or so, at first buzzing against the window, their shadows tracing thick, oily lines on the glass as they flew. I watched them, my heart a frantic drum, expecting them to disperse. Some vanished, and I hoped they were giving up, moving on. My hope was a fool's wish. Moments later, 100 more appeared, then hundreds. Now, thousands, tens of thousands. A living, pulsating wall of black and green, a grotesque tapestry of chitin and buzzing wings, plastered against my window. They block out most of the light, reducing my room to a perpetual twilight. Only the faint yellow of the normal sun, or the bruised red of the other, filters through the gaps in their bodies. I haven't slept properly in days. The buzzing is a constant, overwhelming roar, a chorus of tiny, hungry things. My food and water supply, canned and bottled, might last me another week, 2 at most. I live almost entirely in my bedroom, venturing out only for the barest necessities, securing any new crack, any new point of entry the flies try to tunnel through. My old leather jacket is my only comfort, a familiar weight against the crushing terror. My wristwatch ticks, an absurd, defiant rhythm against the impending end. I'm posting this, my account, to the internet, as if it will do any good. What good is a warning when the world doesn't want to see? What good is truth when it's too horrific to comprehend? The best I can hope for now is that I run out of food and starve to death. A quiet, miserable end. Perhaps. I don't want to know what happens to me if they get in while I'm still alive. I really don't. The air crackled, not with static electricity, but with something far fouler. A smell like ozone and burnt plastic clawed at my throat, stinging my eyes, and then Edward's face, a distorted, pixelated caricature of the man I used to know, stretched and contorted, pushed through the shimmering surface of my laptop screen. His eyes, twin white voids, stared, not at the screen itself, but through it directly into mine, locking me in a gaze that felt impossibly cold. A grotesque, sickening pop echoed in the small room, the sound of impossible pressure being released, and then a hand, elongated and twitching, covered in the green-blue glow of the monitor, clawed its way out. The sheer physical impossibility of it brought a cold, numbing terror that froze the breath in my lungs. It was an obscenity, a violation of reality itself, and it was reaching for me, a digital wraith becoming flesh right before my eyes. It hadn't always been like this. Before the pixels turned to pseudo-flesh, before the screen became a gateway to a digital hell, there was just the unsettling quiet of a life lived on the fringes, and the familiar, nagging feeling that I should have known better. It always started with a feeling, a subtle wrongness, a whisper of a lie that humanity, in its infinite hubris, had decided to call progress. This time, it began with a dead man's online ghost and my own goddamn cursed curiosity. My life, as it often was, had been a series of temporary landscapes and disposable jobs. A few months ago, I'd been stuck on the night shift at a data archiving facility outside of Fargo, a mausoleum of blinking lights and humming servers, where the air was always too cold and smelled faintly of ozone and regret. That's where I'd met Edward. Not a friend, not a colleague in any meaningful sense, just a presence. He was the kind of guy who didn't just understand technology, he seemed to believe he could commune with it. Wiry, intense, with eyes that saw something beyond the physical. Even then, he'd wear those thick-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, always hunched over a console, muttering to himself about gray code and the etheric layer of the internet. Claims that most of the crew dismissed as the usual tech bro eccentricity, just a little more unhinged than average. I, on the other hand, had seen enough unhinged to recognize a different flavor when it presented itself. Edward was obsessed with the human consciousness. Not AI, he'd corrected me once, a flicker of something dark in his eyes when I dared to use the term. AI is an imitation, he'd said, leaning too close, smelling faintly of stale coffee and something metallic, like burnt circuitry. The true future is ascension, uploading the very soul. I just grunted, probably adjusting my worn leather jacket, trying to keep my expression neutral. I wasn't interested in his philosophy. My philosophy revolved around getting through the shift without incident, getting paid, and getting out of town before anything stuck. But Edward, like a particularly persistent burr, seemed to have decided I was a captive audience. He'd corner me by the coffee machine, by the vending machines, even in the dead, echoing silence of the server rows, ranting about quantum entanglement and digital immortality. He'd pull out diagrams that looked like occult symbols rendered in circuit board patterns. I'd nod, feign interest, check my old analog wristwatch out of habit, willing him to finish. He just wanted someone to listen, someone to acknowledge his genius. My fatal flaw, I suppose, is that I often let my guard down just enough to be polite. I never did anything to provoke him, never challenged his theories, just politely dismissed his invitations to join his research. Maybe that was enough. My quiet disinterest, my inherent skepticism, perhaps even my mere survival, was an affront to him. Edward died 3 months after I left that job, electrocuted in his garage, the news report said, found amidst a tangle of wires, custom-built hardware, and scorched circuit boards. An unfortunate accident, they'd called it. I remember thinking, figures. You play with fire, you get burned, or in his case, fried. A grim end for a grim man. I'd packed up my 2 duffel bags, one for clothes, one the go bag, cash, flashlight, protein bars, water, a basic first aid kit, and driven west, finding myself in a nondescript apartment in a nondescript town, working nights at a shipping depot. For a couple of weeks, the silence was almost deafening. The kind of silence that usually preceded something truly awful. Then the messages started. The first one was a comment on a photo I'd posted to a burner social media account, a mundane shot of a sunset over a distant mountain range. It was a fake name, a throwaway account, almost 0 followers. That was the point of it, anonymity. The comment simply read, "Nice sunset, Vance, still chasing horizons?" My blood ran cold. Edward's profile picture too, grinning out at me. I'd blocked the account years ago. Instagram's security was, in my experience, annoyingly effective. It shouldn't have been possible. I immediately assumed someone had hacked Edward's account, or that it was a sick joke from one of his equally unhinged relatives. Ryan, Edward's cousin, always had a sadistic streak. I reported it. The account was suspended. Good. Problem solved. Or so I told myself. Except it wasn't. The comments, always from Edward's defunct account, always with his pixelated grin for a profile picture, began appearing on other platforms. A dead man's digital ghost. My throwaway email started receiving strange attachments. Not spam, but code. Cryptic, alien strings of symbols that looked less like programming and more like a fever dream. Each email, a single subject line. Remember gray code? My old, battered Nokia flip phone, which I used for emergencies and nothing else, started receiving empty calls. Sometimes just a burst of white noise. Sometimes a high-pitched whine that grated on my teeth. Buster, my scruffy terrier mix, usually a creature of calm, stoic devotion, started getting antsy. He'd follow me from room to room, his nose twitching, his low growl a constant undercurrent to the artificial hum of the cheap apartment. He'd fixate on the modem's blinking lights or the TV screen when it was off, whining softly. Animals see things. I've learned things we're too blind or too afraid to acknowledge. I was afraid. All right. This was different from the whispers in the old house, different from the chill that followed the hitchhiker, different from the unnatural warmth of a certain skin collector's parlor. But it was the same underlying wrongness. It was like the world was peeling back another layer, showing me another brand of teeth, a digital one this time. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Someone with a vendetta, someone with too much time and too many technical skills. Police were useless. Cyber harassment, they called it, scribbling on their notepads, their eyes glazing over the moment I mentioned dead men in gray code. "We'll investigate," they'd mumbled, sending me off with a patronizing pat on the shoulder. My faith in institutions was already at an all-time low. This just hammered the last nail into that particular coffin. A week ago, I found myself lying in bed, Buster curled at my feet, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The cheap digital clock on the bedside table glowed, 2:17 a.m. I'd been tossing and turning, my mind refusing to quiet down. The night was a heavy blanket of silence, broken only by the occasional distant siren or the murmur of the old building settling. And then, a sudden ping, a jolt through the quiet. My laptop, sitting open on my desk across the room, less than a foot from the end of my bed, had flared to life. The screen, a pale blue rectangle in the gloom, hummed. I hadn't left it on. Hell, I hadn't even left it switched on. My stomach tightened, a familiar coil of dread. Buster stirred, a low, rumbling growl starting in his chest. His ears were flat against his head, pointed at the laptop, a dark silhouette against the faint glow. The screen scrolled, silently, slowly. It wasn't my desktop. It wasn't even my browser homepage. It was Edward's profile on Facebook. Who the hell still uses Facebook? It was like a digital mausoleum, a relic from a forgotten past. This was a whole new level of intrusion. My fingers twitched, itching for the baseball bat I kept tucked under the bed. Even though I knew it was useless against whatever this was, a hacker, it had to be a hacker. Ryan, probably, trying to scare me. Or worse, trying to blame me for Edward's stupidity. The scrolling stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I was staring at an old photo, Edward and I, at a work gathering years ago. It was from the early days, before his darkness had fully shown itself, before his ambition had curdled into something monstrous. We looked. Normal. Almost happy. A lie. It was always a lie. "All right, Ryan," I murmured, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet room. Buster whined in, pressing closer to my leg. "You've made your point. It's my fault he's dead. Just cut the crap already." Then the photo moved. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Buster let out a sharp, anxious bark, then whimpered. My eyes, wide and unblinking, were glued to the screen. I and everything else in the picture remained perfectly still, frozen in a moment that was long dead. But Edward moved, his head tilted, a slight, almost imperceptible shift. Then he detached himself from the background, a subtle shimmer around his edges, and began to walk. No, not walk, glide. He glided over to the photographer, his pixelated form growing larger and larger, expanding, engulfing every square inch of the full-screen image until his face, now horribly close, filled the entire monitor. My dead acquaintance, Edward, was staring through the laptop screen, staring at me. The white, soulless eyes were already there, even in that old photograph. I just hadn't seen them then. I'd been too busy trying to ignore the truth. "What the hell is this?" I breathed, my voice thin and reedy. This wasn't some deep fake. This wasn't Ryan's twisted sense of humor. This was impossible. My mind raced, clawing for a rational explanation. A video embedded in an image? No, that wasn't how it worked. Not like this. Not that fluid, that organic, that wrong. And then his voice. "Hello, Vance," Edward said. His voice was a mangled echo, as if someone had recorded it, then run it through a meat grinder. It was garbled, crackling like static on an old radio, yet undeniably his. My chest tightened, a cold knot of dread. Had he recorded himself to torture me from beyond the grave? Was this some elaborate, posthumous, digital trap? "You look, well," his inhuman voice gushed, the words dripping with something slimy, something that made my skin crawl. "I like your new routine, the late nights. Very efficient." He knew my habits. He knew my name, my burner accounts, my location. He'd been watching, always watching. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Buster was growling steadily now, a low, continuous sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Edward's demeanor shifted, mirroring the man I'd briefly known. The charming facade, always thin, always brittle, began to crack. His pixelated head tilted even further to one side, a grotesque parody of curiosity. His smile, which had been stretched unnaturally wide, now tightened, brimming with pure malignancy. The dead man's charm, if it could ever be called that, vanished. His pupils, too, were fading, diluting into the sickly white of his irises. Seconds later, all that remained were two blank, empty, milky spheres, like scarred-over wounds. It was as if I were seeing the real Edward at long last, the subhuman thing that had lain dormant beneath his thin shell of intellect and ambition. A thunderous, thudding sound sent a shockwave through my body, vibrating the floorboards. It was a sickening, squelching sound, like something wet being pushed through something tight. Horrified, I watched Edward's hands pressing against the shimmering screen of my laptop. Not just his hands, his whole body. He was pushing, as if he were trapped underwater, struggling against a surface that rippled and distorted with every effort. The screen continued to flex inward, bending, bowing, creaking with a sound that wasn't right, a sound that wasn't possible for electronics. It was the sound of something alive, something struggling. My breath hitched. A guttural scream tore itself from my throat, raw and desperate. I finally accepted it. This wasn't Ryan. This wasn't any digital prank. This wasn't anything that could be explained by earthly rhyme or reason. This was the same brand of impossible horror I'd been running from my entire adult life, just manifesting in a new, technologically advanced form. I wasn't going to wait for my undead abuser. Never again. Not after all I'd seen. Not after all I'd run from. Not after the Sycamore Grove incident, which still clawed at the edges of my memory like a phantom limb. I scarpered from my bed, Buster barking frantically at my heels, beelining for the door of my room. My go bag was right beside it. Just get out. That was the mantra. Just survive. Before I could reach the door, a blinding flash of light erupted from my laptop screen. It was so intense it burned pinpricks into my vision. The door, which I'd left ajar, swung shut with a violent slam, shaking the thin walls. A piercing sound, like a ghastly cry of agony, emitted from the speakers of my laptop. It was Edward's voice, amplified, distorted, a shriek of digital pain that made my teeth ache. "You're not leaving me again, Vance," Edward's mangled voice commanded, rattling the very air. I rotated slowly, my eyes still watering from the flash, to face the digital entity that was slithering free from my laptop screen. The screen itself was stretching around him like elasticated rubber, clinging to his grotesque form as if unwilling to let him go. The thin bezel of the laptop frame groaned under the impossible pressure. When he finally escaped his digital prison, Edward's long limbs, still glowing with the sickly blue-green luminescence of the screen, glitched ghoulishly before me. His arms twitched, his legs buckled, his body seemed to flicker, like a bad connection, before solidifying, becoming more substantial with every agonizing second. He adjusted his posture, the sounds of his movements like 1,000 tiny tearing sounds, standing upright and gazing upon me with those horrible, white, empty eyes. My stalking specter widened his fiendish, Cheshire cat grin. "I found a way to live forever," he whispered, his voice still ragged, but gaining strength, becoming more human, more insidious. "If you join me, Vance, I promise we won't ever fight again. We can be infinite." Buster was a fury of barks and growls, a small, courageous bundle of rage, trying to get between me and the nightmare. I tried the door again, furiously twisting the handle, rattling it. It was being held shut by an invisible, unyielding force, as if bolted from the other side. Twisting my head to look at the monstrous creature behind me, I whimpered, a sound I hated, a sound of absolute terror. Edward slowly stumbled towards me on unsteady, glitching legs, toppling his head to one side, a chilling echo of his old mannerisms. I screeched at the top of my lungs, a primal, animal sound, and turned back to face the door, desperately yanking the handle, trying to rip it from its hinges. That was when I had a dreadful idea, a stupid idea, a suicidal idea. But it was an idea. I darted towards my bedside table, swerving past Edward's outstretched, flickering arms. His reach was impossible, extending unnaturally as I moved, a visual distortion of space. Buster yelped, startled, but stayed right on my heels, snapping at the air around Edward's legs. My hand closed around a half-full glass of water, left there hours earlier. The plastic felt slick in my sweating palm. I turned to face my ex-acquaintance, my former tormentor, now something else entirely, something alien. His lips parted, and a pit of blackness was revealed within his mouth, a vacuum of pixels. That same high-pitched wail erupted from the caverns of his demonic body, the sound of 1,000 dial-up modems screaming in agony, a sound meant to shatter eardrums. He knew what I was about to do, knew it from the look in my eyes, the desperation in my stance. Without a moment's thought, a primal surge of self-preservation overriding every ounce of rational fear. I launched the glass of water at the digital ghoul that was lumbering towards me. It spun end over end, a slow-motion arc of shimmering water molecules. The plastic tumbler, cheap and flimsy, hit Edward square in the chest. Water exploded across his shimmering, translucent skin, soaking his flickering form. Edward screamed, not the digital wail from the speakers, but a robotic cry so deafeningly loud, so utterly devoid of humanity, that my ears popped, a sharp, painful pressure. His eyes, those milky white voids, widened into perfect circles of pure horror. As the water soaked through his unnaturally glowing form, he began to spasm manically, his body glitching and contorting with violent, uncontrolled jerks. He shuddered. His unbound digital form retreated, dissolving back into the shimmering, rippling effect of the screen. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the laptop screen reclaimed him, pulling him back into its confines, the digital surface bubbling and churning as he was sucked in, pixel by pixel, limb by limb. The last thing I saw was his wide, white eyes, burning with furious, frustrated malice, before the screen snapped back to normal, displaying a generic login page. A faint wisp of something that smelled like ozone and burnt toast lingered in the air. My bedroom door swung open with a creak, as if the invisible force that had held it shut had suddenly dissipated, its concentration broken. I didn't hesitate. Buster was already halfway out. I seized my opportunity, my go bag already in hand, and fled my flat, leaving the laptop, the lingering smell, and the fresh layer of trauma behind. I have been living in my car for the past few days, moving from one anonymous town to the next, sleeping in the back seat. Buster curled tightly against me. The cheap motel rooms feel too vulnerable now. Too much technology. Too many outlets. This is the first time I've used any substantial technology since the incident. Huddled in a corner booth of an all-night computer cafe, its fluorescent lights humming, the air thick with stale coffee and desperation. There are plenty of people around, a comfortable hum of chatter and keyboard clacks, and I don't think Edward would be stupid enough to come for me in a public place. But who knows, what's stupid to a thing that can pull itself from a screen? I just needed to write this down, to get it out of my head before it completely consumed me. I keep seeing flickering screens out of the corner of my eye. Every phone, every tablet, every glowing billboard feels like a threat, a potential window for him to peer through, to push through. Every reflection is suspect. Should I just get off the grid entirely? Melt into the wilderness? Avoid technology for the rest of my life? I can't run. He's everywhere now. He is the ghost in the machine, and he knows my name. Character count 9,784.